And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have with us out there already. And of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, crazy going on with the vaccine passport. It's just start right out of the gate with that. There's certainly so much to cover on that and the kind of Nazi tactic behind it. And we certainly are going to do a number of reports on it. And it's big on our radar because they're trying to jam it down the American public's throat, and the global population really is going to say no to this. But we have a lot of little details in there to cover in relation to it. So we're going to do it justice. But tonight we are into X100 Part 2. And it is power-packed, I can tell you, really going deep now on the mystery schools. And so it is Mystery Schools Revealed, Steiner, Stell, and Sorobia. And some of these names are familiar to you, some of them probably aren't, but they're all intertwined and interconnected. And how they all land together and how those threads come together are going to be quite fascinating as the evening wears on. Of course, in the second half of the program, we're going to be taking your questions. So you can ask those all in caps. And Miss Olivia will be putting those together. How's the temperature out there?
People are very grateful for a show tonight.
So am I.
Yeah, I am too.
Fantastic. It's a huge crowd already.
It is a big crowd.
Well, lots of familiar faces, that's for sure. So now we've done a number of episodes relating to the mystery schools, and what it is an ever-widening tapestry, and it's kind of like the undercurrent or the underpinnings of the entire X-Steganography series has to do with the activities of the mystery schools, one way or another. Now, when we think about mystery schools, generally, it conjures up probably a couple of different types of things, because in some sense, we've had both right-hand and left-hand mystery schools. And we've concentrated primarily on the right-handed mystery schools because they've done so much to move the culture forward. But the idea in general is that there's a wisdom tradition and a group that maintains that tradition and preserves those truths and that kind of education, along with very secret knowledge. And it has a kind of undue influence on the course of things over time, helping to shape outcomes in society. And it is often also persecuted politically. That is, there are different power centers that try and push back on its influence. And then we also, in that mystery school group, have the left-hand schools, which operate with a lot of the same techniques, but for very different purposes, and aren't so concerned with moving the culture forward, shall we say. They're after a very different kind of outcome. So we've seen those types of things, and I guess you could really define maybe the right-hand schools as more on the theosophy, anthroposophy side, and the left-hand schools being more like a Crowley type outfit or worse. But just to get us in the ballpark here. So what happens also when the schools are trying to release material out into the public is it operates a little bit differently than, just they don't send out a press release or anything. They've been maintaining this kind of very covert influence on humanity, and they've been able to preserve truths. Something that comes out of the Gurdjieff work is that there are two types of things in terms of a wisdom tradition. It's the what to do and how to do it. So in the case of turning the cheek in the Christian religion, there's knowing what that is all about, but then there's knowing actually the technique for how to do it. So the what to do is out there, and we see it kind of go out over time, and there's different versions of it. But the how to do it stays secret, because when it comes up, it's often persecuted and chased out of town, as it were, or coveted. So the what to do is what we're concerned with when we look at some of these things, and that's why there's so much care taken by these mystery groups. And that goes back a long way, all the way back to the Egyptian mystery schools.
Grandma Tippy Toes has a great question.
Yes.
I wonder if the right and the left have to exist in order to balance one another. And Dash Rendar answered, I've wondered the same, fits with the idea of a power group pulling the strings of both.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. It's inevitable in a sense, just because of the level that humanity is at currently. I don't think it needs to be a permanent setup, but certainly people use things for different purposes, and we've seen it over time. That's just the reality in the physical world. But the idea that they need to kind of try each other's powers out against each other is certainly true.
Fun and games, man. Fun and games.
Exactly. I mean, what I feel about it too is that that's an inevitable outcome of human nature. Ultimately, we should be able to transcend beyond that, of course, and get things going in a very different direction. So, it's all a matter of perspectives, but certainly at this point, at this juncture, there's a lot of good versus evil that is right there on the surface that is usually, kept under wraps in a way. So I think that this is kind of a time for the 800-pound gorilla to come out of the closet and stomp around. And the people who used to say, hey, the 800-pound gorilla's in there, and I used to say, oh, you're nuts, there's no gorilla. Well, they're looking right? Think of the passport that we started the show off with.
RDT wanted to know, Golden Dawn, right or left?
Well, it's interesting because the root of the Golden Dawn actually is the root of the same person who gave us the knowledge about steganography, Johannes Trithemius. And it's his scrolls that were buried there that gave all this incredible mystic information. So I would say the information itself isn't particularly right or left. It is magical sources, and then it's what do you do with that magic once you have it. So I would say it definitely could go either way. But the Golden Dawn featured incredible people, like poets of the time, like Byron and people like that were very interested in it. But also, Crowley was somebody who tried to hijack the entire organization and turn it into something else. So they've had luminaries on both sides of the fence, but no question about it, it's a rich tradition for sure. And again, there's a saying in the Casey readings that evil is just under good. It's not actually its polar opposite. And that's something that we have to consider as well as we look into these things. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're just getting started here with X Series 100 Part 2, and it is the Mystery Schools revealed Steiner, Stell, and Serobia. Now, we're going to cover the setup of the Mystery Schools and then show you the influence of these three, in particular, anthroposophy, Serobia, and Stell, and how anthroposophy and Serobia and theosophy all have this incredible link, and how Stell is somehow in the middle of that also. We're going to explain who those groups are and what the key takeaways are from each of them. Now, when we talk about Mystery Schools, one thing I want to highlight is that the Mystery Schools in the 19th century really they had a public arm finally. And they hadn't done this for many years, but the way that it's explained in Steiner's work is that in the 1840s, scientific materialism had taken humanity down to a very low level of just considering things in nature as obsolete compared to what could be measured, weighed, and processed. And so it took us into a very different way of looking at things and became the triumphant a bit. And what's interesting is that it was discovered and sort of professed by a couple of very young German physicists of the era who were basically about 25, 26 years old. So it was an unusual thing for it to take a grip the way that it had. Now, the Mystery Schools understood that it was inevitable that humanity, with industrialization and a number of things, was moving into this direction of super materialism. But they were afraid at the level, the concern grew dramatically with how much the spirit side of things was getting carved out of regular society and how scientific materialism was going to be the rule of the day. And this very kind of harmonic movement in anthroposophical terms, this technological reality was going to settle in and really trap humanity. And the way that it's said is that they reasoned to themselves that in 100 years they wouldn't even recognize humanity because humanity's spirituality would be so separated out from who they were. So they devised an idea that they would release a lot of material that had always been secret. And this caused a lot of contention, and even you could say it was the war of the mystery schools between 1840 and 1870. But as it turned out, they decided to go with spiritualism as a way to enrich the culture and keep it out of this scientific gridlock and this box of scientism. And as it turned out, half of that experiment went really well because spirituality and spiritualism took off, but it became too associated with mediumship. And then it started to become too much of an obsession. And literally, if you go back to that period, you can see there's such a spiritualism craze about the years 1850, 1860. So much so that even Abraham Lincoln and his wife were desperately caught up in that when their son died. And they sought out the help of mediums, which there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that from the Brotherhoods and the mystery schools point of view, it was too much of an emphasis, like it was all balanced around this. It became just a curiosity of, can I talk to someone in the other world, as opposed to what it was meant to do, which was to say, you're composed of a physical world and a spiritual world, and the scientific part is just a step that you're going through in the physical, and it's not supposed to encompass everything that you have aimed for as a culture. So there were great dangers involved with things going in this materialist direction. Now, a lot of those schools had kept the information so solid and so tight for so many years, they didn't want to let the information out. So that's where a lot of those battles came out of. But what happened was it was a small group in there, about 10, 15% of those schools that decided we're stepping up and we have to do this. And the trade-off ultimately came with Helena Blavatsky, who was the leader of the Theosophical Society, founded it in 1875. But the different secret societies had been aware of her and tracking her since she was born. So astrologically, she had been predicted. We hear a lot of things about Blavatsky when it comes to traditional academic literature, and don't believe any of it. I mean, she had her faults like anybody, but she was a remarkable person, and she set off so many things in people that it's hard to even get to it in just one show. But this was a very powerful mystic medium, and she was a psychic, a philosopher, and a teacher. And she had a real role in the moving humanity forward and developing this real perspective that so many people still owe so much to the Theosophical Society. And we'll get into what the problems were and what happened with Theosophy. But in any case, so she brings forward the Theosophical Society, and suddenly yoga is introduced in America. Suddenly meditation, reincarnation. And she writes Isis Unveiled in the 1870s, and it blows everything away. All the mystery school knowledge is really out there in that book. And Isis Unveiled is quite remarkable if you think about it. There's nothing like it. There's really no antecedent to it. It is, basically, here's an entirely new thing that you haven't heard of, and it blew everyone away. So it changed things a lot too, but she instantly became under attack as a result of it. And she was under attack by these schools that didn't want this information revealed. And she subsequently would be put into a kind of psychic imprisonment, as they called it, that when her vision went up to view things on the spiritual plane, they would be throwing all types of different illusions at her, which adds the kind of uneven quality of the later work. What I can say about Blavatsky, coming from Russia as she did, that she was, because she was a woman and because she was Russian, they were suspicious of her immediately in America. And she wanted to work directly with these male-only mystery schools. Certainly there were female counterparts in the grand scheme of things, but at that point in America where she had turned up, this was the order and the rule of the day. What we get out of that is she transforms things so much, but she is in fact pushed out of the country and eventually ends up going to Egypt and India. In India in particular, she founds the Theosophical Society again with a new branch and a new version, and she really takes that culture by storm. But then there are problems there also. And what happens is she ends up going back to England. And in London, she really starts to find incredible traction. So it's gone from New York now to India, with some stops in between in Egypt. And theosophy is really kind of causing this explosion of spiritual knowledge to come forward. And this is a crucial thing, but it's also almost a clumsy thing in a sense, because the mystery schools haven't done it before. They've kept that information and they know how to keep the tradition. And then here's Blavatsky, and she's ready to go with the mystical information. And she also is antagonistic to some of those schools, saying, I want you to admit me as a member, because even though I'm a woman and I'm Russian, and this is an American mystery school, if you don't, I'm going to let even more secrets out. And so they decide among themselves that they're going to keep her in this kind of psychic imprisonment. And so it does explain a lot of the issues that came up in relation to Blavatsky. So what happens is Blavatsky moves the leadership of theosophy to Annie Besant. And Besant is really quite fascinating because she's actually more of a political activist, and she's been leading labor marches, and she's been trying to get Irish home rule, and she's been, she's from England, but she is very politically active, and in fact will play a great role in politics. This is not someone who is sort of dreaming out there about the different things she could do. Mystically, she was very involved in all kinds of day-to-day politics. And if you look before she really gets involved in all this with Blavatsky, it's quite fascinating because you can find her in the news headlines of the day leading these marches and so on. Now, what happens, and it's quite fascinating, is that Rudolf Steiner will, who's an Austrian scholar, is he someone who is going through a real spiritual transformation and has come out of a kind of a Rosicrucian mystery tradition. And he works with the Theosophical Society in Germany, and they decide, this guy's incredible, let's put him up as the guy who can lead theosophy there. And what happens is that Steiner, who would eventually become the leader of anthroposophy and spiritual science, decides outright that they're going kind of in the wrong direction, and that they're doing things with too much of an Eastern bent, and that they're getting obsessed with the death of Blavatsky. They've kind of lost course a little bit. But he had tremendous respect for Besant. So he becomes basically Besant's understudy there for a while, and she really has a lot to say about his German chapter of Theosophy, which is growing rapidly, and he's showing that he can be a dramatic teacher on his own. But what happens ultimately is that Theosophy gets caught up in the search for a world teacher about a century before it was supposed to happen. And the world teacher, they decide, is going to come through this Hindu child named Krishnamurti. And so there's a long story that unfolds there, and it is going to thread into everything that we're talking about. But Besant and her efforts here to transform the world become almost a little impatient. And Steiner's realizing she's getting a lot of undue influence, and a lot of people are basically in her ear and influencing her in a way that is not healthy spiritually. And he decides, I have to kind of go on my own track. And so he founds Anthroposophy with the German chapter of Theosophy. And all those people split off from Theosophy, and Theosophy, signs off on Steiner. But Steiner really was tapping into the deeper Western tradition of the mystery schools, which was the tradition that was coming forward in this particular time. And a lot of the push in Theosophy at that time was for the Eastern mystery schools, which is they are two sides of the same coin, and yet the times and the methods are a little bit different. And so the way that Steiner explains it is there was so much of an emphasis now around the Eastern traditions setting up the Western tradition, that the Western tradition to not move forward and take its time in this particular paradigm right now would be a huge mistake. It would be like stepping backwards, because the Eastern mystery schools had set up this scenario in the first place. And so a kind of esoteric Christianity needed to come forward. This was the state of things, and what eventually came out of anthroposophy were these incredible movements of biodynamic farming, the Waldorf schools, and incredible knowledge about our ancient past with Atlantis and a threefold social order, just incredible. You have to say this in relation to Steiner, that for someone who was a mystic, he was the best scholarly mystic. And so he stands out quite unusually in that regard. And Steiner is going to play a huge role because as we go through the development of the mystery schools now, the 21st century is going to be in many ways the key pivot point for anthroposophy. And Steiner also introduced eurythmy, which was the telling of spiritual stories in dance and movement, and also the transforming of the audiences and the players through these mystery plays, which are quite dramatic, and I would say are kind of a little known aspect of the canon of Steiner's thought. But he actually released a lot of truths there in a manner that was very different than his kind of scholarly function. And anyone who gets into anthroposophy, that's a very key portion to check out. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are here on X100, going deep into the mystery schools with Steiner, Stell, and Sorobia. I want to remind you to go to the Dark Journalist website and sign up for our newsletter. That's something that is going to keep us in touch with the massive things that we see going on in relation to censorship. It's gone beyond the beyond, even to a point where mentioning it becomes silly because the cancel culture is so heavy duty and getting rid of so many things. I actually think a lot of that is going to backfire, by the way. What do you think of that, Ms.
Well, I have a question for you, which is a great question. Gail and Joy R. want to know, can sacred spiritual works reverse wicked physical actions?
Well, I mean, it depends on the particular thing that you're talking about. But there's no question that, there's a whole forgiveness doctrine in the Christian tradition. And that calls for good works. I remember there is that incredible scene where the rich man comes up to Jesus in the New Testament and says, "Oh, I've been, following your stuff. I just want to, really get into the teaching. And what do I do next? Just tell me anything that I'll do." And he says, "Well, go sell everything you own and come up and follow me." And the guy walks away. And Jesus says it'll be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. It doesn't mean if you're wealthy that you can't get into heaven, but it's just the idea of the trappings of the entire thing. It's the prioritization. But it's quite an interesting challenge, I would say, there in the moment. But certainly, I would say there's another scene, too, where, Jesus is there with the two men. It is Good Friday after all, so we're kind of in the Jesus paradigm tonight. But when Jesus is on the cross, he is looking over and they say, "Can't you, if you're the Son of God, save us too?" And one of them says that, and then the other one says, "No, just remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus looks at him and says, "You're home free."
Are you going to make me cry?
So I would have to say that's probably the best answer. But it is interesting because there's a whole thing in the mystery schools in the Gurdjieff tradition about conscious suffering. And that's a piece that we get into tonight as well. I'm actually going to bring Gurdjieff in at this point because I want to give us that whole panorama of the mystery school traditions, because theosophy and anthroposophy come in it with a very spiritual aspect. And the Gurdjieff work is also spiritual, but it comes from the physical up. And so there's all this emphasis around work, and there's all this emphasis around knowing your machine, which is the body. And there's this emphasis around not being asleep, about being alert. And we're going to actually talk about a Gurdjieff exercise here tonight. I have a quote from Blavatsky before we get to Gurdjieff, which gives us an idea of how she sees the mystery schools, which I think is key. Both in the case of Steiner and Blavatsky, I have some quotes about their versions of the mystery schools. All right, so she says the best proof you can have for esotericism is that every ancient religion, philosophical cult, consisted of an esoteric or secret teaching and an exoteric outward public worship. Furthermore, it is a well-known fact that the mysteries of the ancients comprised with every nation the greater secret and lesser public mysteries. In the celebrated rites called Eleusinian in Greece, from the Hierophants of Samothrace in Egypt, and the initiated Brahmins of the India of old, down to the later Hebrew rabbis, all preserved the fear of the profane, their real bona fide beliefs secret. The Jewish rabbis called their secret religious series the Merkabah. Sound familiar? The exterior body, the vehicle, or the covering which contains the hidden soul, their highest secret knowledge. Not one of the ancient nations ever imparted through its priests its real philosophical secrets to the masses, but allotted to the latter only the husks. So this is something that's very important for us. One other, just moving forward on that quote, still Blavatsky. Occult alphabets and secret ciphers are the development of the old Egyptian hieratic writing, the secret of which, in the days of old, was in the possession only of the hierogrammist or initiated Egyptian priests. Everything we talk about in relation to steganography, it's in the hands of these initiates. They are the ones who talk to each other with it. So we have kind of a bastardized steganography when it comes to secrecy in government programs dealing with advanced technology, for example. But this is the root of it. If we want to know what steganography is, this is where she's coming from with it. So she's giving us some idea there about the secret wisdom schools. Now, if we take the same position about the mystery schools and we talk from the perspective of Gurdjieff, I'm going to read you this. It's from, of course, Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous. And they're talking about what happens when you use these special religious techniques that were preserved by mystery schools for years and years. So Ouspensky says, on one occasion in connection with the description of exercises in concentration and bringing the attention from one part of the body to another, Gurdjieff asked, when you pronounce the word I aloud, have you noticed where this word sounds in you? We did not at once understand what he meant, but we very soon began to notice that when pronouncing the word I, some of us definitely felt as if this word sounded in the head. Others felt it sounded in the chest, and others over the head outside of the body. Gurdjieff listened to all these remarks and said that there was an exercise connected with this, which according to him had been preserved up to our time in the monasteries of Mount Athos. A monk kneels or stands in a certain position and lifting his arms, which are bent at the elbows, he says ego aloud and drawn out while listening to at the same time where the word ego sounds. The purpose of this exercise is to feel I every moment a man thinks of himself and to bring I from one center to another. So it's a very interesting exercise for us here to just say I and to identify where it's coming from. Miss Olivia, you can lead the way.
Oh, so we're going to take a minute and everybody say I and feel where it's coming from in your body and your chakras.
And where do you find it coming from?
Definitely my third eye.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. All right. I can feel it most definitely in my voice box, basically. That's where it comes from for me. But I think that this gives us an idea that there are techniques and exercises that start to get us a greater awareness right off the bat with our bodies. And that's a crucial kind of piece of where the mystery schools just leave little pieces out there for us to pick up on throughout the printed histories. And there's a much deeper level when you're in the school, but we start to get an idea, because one of the key things the schools are trying to do is develop in us a magnetic center around which all of these ideas can lead us to. Because for them to just give us wholesale, the cream of the crop of the mystery knowledge without any kind of preparation on our side would devastate the entire society, no question about it. So the way that they've done it by introducing things and bringing things out, and for us to look at the information and the material that's been brought forward and to start to work with it, and some things work for people. Some people will be very into theosophy, others will be into the Merkaba, others will be into the Enneagram. Some people will be definitely working with Steiner's knowledge of higher worlds. When we look at that, as a casualty of another red pen there, when we look at that, it starts to go, and we start to explore these traditions that have become the public sort of intermediaries for the mystery schools. And I do number those among that class. And very often people write to me and they say, well, where should I go for a mystery school now? Is there a mystery school you can recommend? I have to tell you that I think independent study is the best option right now. And I think that a lot of the schools that are available online, we come to things when we're ready for them very often, but there's also a lot of kind of, things that are really marketing heavy and aren't so good on this front, that use the name mystery school, like Gaia TV or something like that. And I wouldn't recommend any of that stuff. But I can tell you that coming out of the traditions of Steiner's work, which is really a 21st century work, even though he was around in the early 20th century, I really feel like when we're looking at this, you have to kind of develop up to that point. And so I want to identify now the levels of the mystery schools. So you have, and this is a very general list, but you have the actual mystery schools. And I wouldn't say that any of us on a normal day are going to walk into a mystery school. They remain hidden largely, and they remain hidden in terms of that influence on society, because while they are hidden, it's like that thing that we started off with, the Gurdjieff quote, the what to do and how to do it. That how to do has to remain on a hidden level. Although we're seeing a lot more of their information out in the public now, thank God. And then I would say the next level is called the lesser schools. And the lesser schools know a tremendous amount from our point of view, but they know maybe about half as much as the actual mystery schools do. So there's a kind of a level, a degree there. And then below that are arcane schools, and arcane schools preserve the traditions as they were. So they're not trying to add to them in any way. They're just a reenactment of the Osiris traditions, or the different types of traditions. And then below that would be these private study groups where you develop this magnetic center by, working with other people on these techniques. And again, the public study groups, which we see people doing in all kinds of different ways, from Buddhism to ancient Greek knowledge, whatever it is, those things are out there, certainly. And I would say most of the time you run across the public side. And then, like private study schools. The arcane schools, the lesser schools, and the mystery schools are something that we, don't run across in the general wave of everyday life, but they're there, and as we go along this path, we can run into that work. And one of the things that Steiner said about anthroposophy, which I would call a real bona fide public mystery school, no question about it. But he said that it's not to take you out of the realm of your everyday life. It's just to enhance what you're doing. And that's what I think the real difference is with this style of thing. It's not that we have to go away to a monastery and learn the secret knowledge, which sounds like it would be really kind of fascinating. But I think we have to keep in mind exactly what we're talking about. The fourth way is, in fact, designed, the Gurdjieff work, to be done right in your normal everyday life. So if you're a librarian, you study the fourth way as a librarian. You're not doing anything exotic. You are just who you are, doing your thing. If you own a small business, if you work in a record store, whatever it is, you're there practicing these things. It has to be done in the throes of your actual everyday life. So there's different considerations and different things there. But certainly, I would say that when we look at it, we get an idea for how these different schools develop. I always recommend Knowledge of Higher Worlds, which is Steiner's book, In Search of the Miraculous, which is Gurdjieff's book. Edgar Cayce on Atlantis, which is another mystery school. Huge influence there with Cayce and the incredible work that he gave us. And then I would say The Secret Doctrine in relation to Theosophy. Yes.
It seems like certainly there's value in reading what other people have discovered, especially when they're mystics. But ultimately, doesn't it come down to having your own practice? It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it is authentic to you and it works, and it brings you closer to enlightenment, to God, to realization.
There's no question. Well, and the thing is, too, I think when we talk about these things, it is books, groups, information are to bring about that connection, that magnetic center to this work. And the study of the mystery schools goes into everything. It goes into art, architecture. It's not an archaic thing either. Like we look back to the 19th century, and that's it. The Steiner's work, in fact, there was a prediction that this was the era where anthroposophy would really kind of begin to blossom the way that it should. There are always influences going on from the mystery side in modern society. They come in heavy at times, they withdraw at other times. But certainly, when we look to the founding and the first release of these mystery school techniques, which gave us people like Blavatsky and Besant and Krishnamurti and Steiner and Cayce, we can see that there's a really powerful rush of information that comes out. On this program, we've had people like Gigi Young, of course, who can outline so many things on a spiritual level. And so, I think that Gigi really sees herself as somebody who is sharing mystical information as opposed to just a teacher of, mystery techniques or anything. But it's that type of incredible information that is available to us. There are some phenomenal people and phenomenal things for us to study. So it's not for a lack of incredible information right now that the society is not moving forward. I think just with the people that we have in this program, you can really start to see the things that you can connect in with. The work of Dr. Joseph Farrell relating to secret and hidden arcane truths in society. Of course, Catherine Austin Fitt's work, Ilana Freeland's work. There's an incredible range of people who can help us see the world as it is. And I don't think that the mystery schools are supposed to be something where we're just supposed to go off and think about, I'm trying to be spiritual or something. It's an integrated process. And that's why I think the Gurdjieff work is actually quite good for this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X Series 100, Part 2. This is Mystery Schools Revealed, Stell, Sarobia, and of course, Steiner. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program, so you can ask those in caps. And Miss Olivia, how's it going out there?
Vincognito says the Sarmuni, G's Sarmung, liken themselves to bees collecting honey, knowledge. At times, some of the knowledge is released publicly, but they also withdraw. We seem to be in a withdrawal period.
Yeah, well, I think what they do is they release the information. That's it's interesting because Sarmung is supposedly where Gurdjieff got the Enneagram, which is that fascinating transformative symbol to study that he brought out first, way before they did all these kind of crazy things with the Enneagram. For a while, it was like a guess your type game. But it is a very good point that I think it's important. You see, if you put that information out there through these different individuals, and if there are these strands for these independent communities to come together and develop, then what happens is people get to work on those ideas, and the mystery traditions can sort of watch what people do with it. And certainly there were schools that came after Theosophy. I can think of all kinds of them. The Church Universal with Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who shows up tonight in a couple of segments. This is going to be, what I find is that it's not that there's not value in those things. There are. Alice Bailey comes after theosophy. It just seems like there's a watering down of the really kind of strong, powerful essence of theosophy, anthroposophy as it came through, as it showed up initially. And certainly through the work of people like Steiner and Casey, we get the foundations of what we're talking about. But that whole tradition and that whole thing can explode for us now, because as I see it, they've predicted that this is the time that we rediscover all of their incredible knowledge. And I'll tell you, it seems to me that the mainstream has been trying to talk us out of this for the past 2 decades and put us on this whole weird, in general, fear track. And I'll tell you, a very suspicious thing that's going on now is they're trying to tie in the whole domestic terrorist bill and the clampdown on society, and they're starting to lace in. I've been seeing these articles that are starting to equate things like Q, for example, which was never violent to start with anyway, but it was sort of the piñata for the mainstream media. And it's something which on this program, we also always discourage people from getting into that. But they've started to equate that with New Age thought. And I have now several examples in high profile newspapers and magazines that are doing that. And I'm starting to look at that and saying, the next thing that they want to do is say, you can't think about these ideas. Don't think about Atlantis. Don't think about psychic phenomena. Don't think about aligning yourself spiritually unless you're doing it through Bill Gates' app. That's I mean, it's going to be the passport to, you don't need just a vaccine passport, but your passport for ascension is going to be, taking the extra app, And so that's where the idiocy, is really creeping in. They're trying to creep into these different areas where they don't belong. And as far as I'm concerned, we have to draw a very hard line in the sand on that.
Well, there's infiltration everywhere.
Yes.
Do you want
absolutely.
to talk about that in relation to the mystery schools?
Yeah. Let's see. Well, where do we go next? Let's do this. A quick line here about Steiner laying out how this all happened, and then we're going to jump into some infiltration of these mystery schools. All right. Quote, and this is from a fantastic book called Spiritualism, Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy by Rudolf Steiner, an eyewitness view of occult history, which is a series of really deep lectures on how much Steiner reveres Blavatsky, in fact, even though he can see the problems from what happened with Theosophy later. Quote, you all know that a theosophical movement has existed since 1875, just as spiritualism has done for the last 40 years. Theosophy has been busy establishing as a solid truth that the material world is not all that there is, but that there are higher beings, real facts, and beings that cannot be reached and investigated solely by the external senses. Spiritualism has its own methods for investigating the existence of a spiritual soul world. Theosophy is also interested in these higher worlds. It is a simple historical fact that before they started working in a theosophical manner, the founders of the theosophical movement were part of the spiritualist movement. It's true. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, the great messengers of the theosophical movement, came out of the spiritual movement. And some people have quipped that the early Theosophical Society was a society of discontented spiritualists. In fact, all Blavatsky and Olcott were seeking was the truth about the spiritual realm, and they came to the conclusion that Theosophy was the right approach. What they changed was the method, the research techniques. I shall not go here into all the reasons for the change. And then one other little line here. The mystery schools constitute an actual society of individualities working together and influencing each other. The theosophist is aware of their existence and calls them the great brotherhood of adepts. If we honestly believe in evolution, we must at least believe in this as a possibility. For those who have experienced it can testify that it really exists. Materialism peaked around the middle of the 19th century. Higher beings then saw that a materialist tide was unavoidable and that they would need to provide the counterforces. They were not in the least critical of this material movement, knowing that modern technology would make powerful, much-needed progress in the process. This is why we shouldn't fight the materialist movement, but the destructiveness of the materialist science in respect to the soul demands a counterpole be provided, a spiritual stream to act as a counterpart to the material stream in humanity. So this is quite important. What it's saying is, just as we've said on this program, like, we're not against technology. The people in the ideas room are not against technology. What it is, in fact, is we cannot be caught unawares by this advent of technology taking over every aspect of our lives. In fact, so that we need to become its master, as opposed to just being, the slave of this technology. And this is where the Ahrimanic side of Steiner's cosmology comes in, because that Ahrimanic force wants to catch humanity drowsy and take it over with this technology and lock it into a virtual reality that he refers to as the eighth sphere. And we've done programs on the eighth sphere, and we've done them with Gigi Young, and I highly recommend those, because I think a lot of her explanations about how that functions and operates in the 21st century are very accurate. But I think what Steiner was trying to warn us of was the advent of the technology would lock us in an artificial cycle of evolution through Ahriman, in that, as opposed to our normal cycle of evolution, which is supposed to take us in a totally different spiritual direction, this Ahrimanic evolution, working through the technology in the 21st century, would attempt to capture humanity, in fact. And so this is what we are looking out at, and what we are seeing in the kind of Gates revolution, in these different aspects that we're seeing with artificial intelligence attempting to take over our day-to-day functions, make choices about our children, our family life, our physical desires. This is exactly what he was warning about. But by contrast, by the way, the Theosophical Society was looking at a kind of rosier picture for the 21st century, and what they were seeing was, we're going to evolve into this next root race, and that next root race, by the way, is going to be psychic, and they're going to communicate telepathically, and they're going to have a higher spiritual sense. We're all going to be so much better off. The problem is, and the world teacher is going to come and help us lead the way. And so I actually believe in a lot of that. I think both are true in a sense. But Steiner really highlighted that the Ahrimanic portion is the real bridge that humanity has to cross. And this is the crossroads that we're at. And it's extremely dangerous because, like World War II, for example, there was incredible carnage as a result of the new technology and the ways that people could try to annihilate each other. Well, now we're in a totally different ballgame, far, far beyond that with the technology. So the danger for humanity, I would say, is gigantic, which is why I think the mystery traditions become more and more important in our understanding and our working with these things. This is the period that they predicted we'd plug back into this and get so much out of it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are here with X100. We're going deep on Steiner, Stell, and Serobia, the Mystery Schools Revealed. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half. And I'm going to jump into a section here that goes into Stell and Richard Keenager and some very dramatic revelations about Atlantis and Lemuria and the rebuilding of the kingdom of God. Yes, very unusual stuff coming out of Stell. But before we get there, Miss Olivia.
Clive Richardson wanted to know, what is the actual purpose or reason for mystery schools? World Change Brief wanted to know, why is the word mystery used? It's confusing. Sam Rick said mystery means missed story. What do you think?
Wow, those are all very interesting. The mysteries are the mysteries. There's a great deal of mystery in our lives, in our spiritual understanding, in our relationships, in our own development. So I like the large-scale philosophical edge of the question, but all I can say is each person knows what a mystery is to themselves, and they've had certain kind of involvement with that. The mysteries in the Greek tradition, in the Egyptian tradition, were the deeper aspects of soul knowledge that a person could attain to if they exerted a certain amount of will in that direction to learn these things. And I would say that there's a lot of different ways to see how it functions for us, but certainly the preservation of that deeper spiritual knowledge and the ability of these kind of higher beings to help humanity move along that path to a better evolution, and to make sure that in the process of their developing that they don't destroy themselves, it is certainly part of that. And beyond that, I think the proper spiritual evolution of humanity as a whole. But it's a great question.
Can I cut to the chase?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so is there, would you say that the mystery schools all agree to a certain extent on it? The amazing thing is that life here is a mystery. We don't know who we are, where we came from. There's all these different opinions on it. The mystery schools, is there some kind of a consensus about the source of human life and consciousness, about God and the structure of the universe?
Well, they all have a spiritual edge to them. Even the left-hand schools understand there are spiritual forces involved. But, I'd say that what they all agree upon is that the society at large is largely ignorant of the incredible impact of the mystery traditions and the incredible secrets contained even in, like powerful religious texts like the Bible, or, in the different ways that people have apprehended religious thought and spiritual thought. The thing is, religion very often is kind of a textbook. It's kind of a guidebook. But at a certain point, you're on your own. And when you're on your own, you have all those principles you learned through these different traditions. So I think it goes back and forth in relation to, the role of that kind of knowledge or information and how they perceive it. It's definitely a deeper spiritual understanding, one way or another. So let's take a look here at how there's some very unusual attempts by these mystery schools to influence us, and how sometimes when they do it and it comes out in real time, and we go just from thinking about, this mystery tradition to what people have actually done. For example, as I mentioned with anthroposophy, they developed spiritual science. They developed biodynamic farming and all these different things that a society can use. So it wasn't just theoretical information. They gave you actual knowledge to apply. And then they said that the wisdom of the ancients is not just the things that they knew, it's the application. That's what they would actually do with it. That's the actual Goetheanum there, the headquarters in Dornach, Switzerland, for anthroposophy. That was designed, and it's interesting because, of course, the Nazis movement, which was very contentious even in its early days with the Steiner work, and with Theosophy, from which it grabbed the swastika and turned it into a total different thing. But that's the original Goetheanum, and I think it speaks to us even from an architectural level when we look at that. And we can see that Steiner was trying to impart to us this information, knowledge of higher worlds and its attainment. That's really kind of a good place for us to start with Steiner's work, because that's really how we move into thinking of things beyond theory, and we start to integrate that spiritual vision into our lives. And so we do it in a variety of different ways that set off and ignite those things in our imagination or in our understanding. What happens along the way is that there was an attempt by Annie Besant. I actually have some wonderful exsteganography images I want to share, and I want to get into something about Besant here. So this is absolutely fascinating exsteganography image from this artwork from Theosophy. And the X was incorporated in their actual logo. as we get in here. I would say that Besant is another one who took this spiritual stream and made it something alive in the world and didn't just keep it on a heady level, which, I like things on a heady level sometimes, frankly, but it is nice to see what happens when these things are applied and they come out in the real world and we get to kind of observe them. That original Theosophical logo, which has, both the Star of David and the swastika and the Egyptian Ankh, the extegonography was embedded directly in their logo. And the phrase, there is no higher religion than truth, was the other piece that Theosophy brought forward. And this incredible kind of earthquake that Theosophy started by bringing this out and by giving us that, the deeper X knowledge, the extegonography embedded, and bringing that out publicly, which helped us get to anthroposophy. And the different things that Besant and Colonel Olcott and Blavatsky brought forward in doing these things, we have to remember that that's where this whole modern wave started, there in the late 19th century, early 20th century, for giving us all those things. Right now we'll see somebody walk down the street with a yoga pack on. And, that's really, I look at that and I say to myself, it's really the influence of Theosophy and making that Eastern side of things palatable and balanced out with the Western knowledge. Of course, Besant launched the career of Krishnamurti, and we're going to see Besant and Krishnamurti pop up here in a very interesting part of this story called Sarobia. Sarobia is an intentional community that was founded around 1920. And it was founded by someone named Robert Logan, who was a disciple of Besant's, but he was a Wall Street lawyer. And his wife, Sarah, was a kind of a debutante, and she had a bookbinding business, and he was a sculptor. And in addition to being this Wall Street guy who'd gone to Harvard. So something really dramatic happened in this attempt, and I see a number of different attempts for intentional communities spinning off of these mystery traditions. Some of them go off course and really off the rails, and some of them are just there for a while and do incredible work. We've talked about J.G. Bennett's work on this program in the Claymont Society, which he developed in West Virginia. But what I think is quite fascinating is they leave behind this incredible footprint, and then they withdraw, and we can't see exactly where this stuff is coming from. But Besant herself, as I said, was someone who had brought forward an incredible combination of political action and also wanted to move. She had become Blavatsky's main disciple, in addition to Emma Britton, and they both, had basically become who Blavatsky was going to leave things off to. And Emma Britton, who was here in Boston, actually, she ended up running afoul of Blavatsky because she was coming again from that more Western Christian esoteric tradition, and Blavatsky by that point had gone totally Eastern. But as we can see with Besant and Gandhi, who was one of her direct disciples, the whole point around the nonviolent demonstration comes directly out of theosophical tradition. Gandhi used it, and then what happened? He inspired Martin Luther King. So the entire civil rights movement now rests on the actions of Annie Besant, who was protesting in the 1870s for the conditions of working girls in factories. So we have to see how these things are more than just the visionary side of things. The visionary side is so powerful and so important, and it feeds the other side. But we can see that these movements actually had a direct impact on the society around them, in fact. And, in particular, when we're looking at Besant, There's no question about it. One of the societies or the intentional communities that Krishnamurti was associated with Besant was Sarobia. And Sarobia was in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and it's kind of an interesting memory. There's not a lot of documentation around it. Thank God someone named Michael Bergeron wrote a book about it because he became very fascinated with it, and he started to drill down on all the details about Sarobia. And Sarobia is Sarobia, and it is a theosophical satellite school, collective, art collective, you could even call it, the same way that we've seen with Halcyon. But Halcyon wasn't a Besant project. But as we know, people like Vice President Wallace was deeply involved with the Halcyon Temple in California. So we start to get a handle on the powerful wave of theosophy and how the incredible impact that it's had on America. So there's a lot of mysteries around Logan. And Logan was a vegetarian. He was the president of the Anti-Vivisectionist Society, had incredible regard for nature, and he was trying to develop along the lines that Besant wanted him to develop this community. There's a lot of strange stories in relation to Sarobia. One of them is about these incredible sundials that he would carve. And what happened was when people went back there later, they experienced very unusual magnetic anomalies, which they've demonstrated now. And they can't figure out what's going on with those original sundials. Well, there's another piece with our friend Logan, which is he's the last descendant of James Logan, who was William Penn's secretary. And there's a lot of deep mysticism. When we did an episode on the Mason-Dixon line for the X series, there's a lot in there that is going to tie this in. But so what are we looking at with Sarobia? We have to get a little more background on it. So Besant and Krishnamurti were deeply involved with it. And remembering that Krishnamurti now had decided that he wasn't going to be a part of a theosophy anymore at a certain point. But here he is still working at that point with Besant. One of the interesting things that I found out that they had there at Sarobia was an entirely underground setup of 15 rooms. And this is something, I guess, that's still there. And I don't think they've done any excavating on that because everything at that place is so overgrown. But to me, these are kind of like initiatory rite centers. The official story is, hey, they wanted a cool place to hang out in the summer. I don't quite see that. What's interesting is the entire description is not there, but it says dedicated to the mysteries and the integrity. And then it says something about the freedom of a bird. So it seems to me something was going on with the development of those rooms beneath the complex. And I'm not suggesting that in a sinister fashion, but I actually think that they were kind of initiatory setups there because everything is so artistic around this place. One of the artists who was living there, in fact, contributed this amazing artwork, and he was actually a very popular impressionist painter. We'll get into him shortly here. But that is, in fact, the Theosophical logo and this incredible artwork, which I'm going to give more information on. But it's giving us an idea of where this community was coming from. So in Sarobia, they also had something which was, it was actually later mimicked in an episode of The Prisoner, which is the human chessboard. And that is literally human parts.
So is that a picture from The Prisoner, or is that a
No, that's a picture from The Prisoner show.
Okay.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but it's the same. I'm going to show where that ties up. This is very interesting to me. There's an esoteric aspect to this human chessboard, which goes back to the original development of chess. And I think we're going to learn a lot as we go. I found other examples of this also. And I think that its development and the fact that it's left over there in Sarobia, the Logans invited friends over for a friendly game of human chess, giving each participant a costume that signified one of the 32 pieces used for the contest: kings, queens, pawns, knights, bishops, rooks, both black and white. Well, we could look at that as kind of an Illuminati style thing. And yet, remember, the Illuminati is actually the reverse of everything that these mystery schools do. So they're kind of like a weird caricature inversion of the facts.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Catherine Harris says that chessboard is wild. Like, who calls the moves? So who's in
Yeah.
charge? Do you know of the chessboard?
Well, I know how they've depicted it, but
Mhm.
of course, without an actual eyewitness testimony, it would be hard to say. But I think that the fact that it's there, also the fact that there's allusions to imagery of Humpty Dumpty and Alice in Wonderland, let us know we're in a whole mystery school wing of this Sorovia Society. This is Sorovia, and that is actually our friend Logan in full-on kind of wizard gear, I guess you could say, with his
Awesome.
sundial. And so this is somebody who really had gone over and deep into this mystery place. Now, his wife and daughter, this gets very interesting because, I actually want to show this shot. This is him with a very unusual image of an owl that he carved. Again, the mysticism runs deep. Now, I know that we've seen things like owls connected with Moloch and all that kind of stuff. I don't know what's going on here with his really deep devotion to animals, but I think that we're seeing the mystical side of this, the kind of inverse from the Illuminati-esque side of it. Sarah Logan, which was Robert's wife, and her daughter Deborah. Sarah is also very interesting indeed. And again, when we look at Sarah, I think we're looking at somebody who Annie Besant was taking on as a personal disciple. And at a certain point, Besant came to her and said, "You know what I'd like to do? I would like you to let go of all your servants. I'd like you to do it as kind of a character building exercise. You've got 16 servants here. You don't need them. Do the work yourself." And so she had to take this on. Remember, she came from this kind of debutante background, and she had to let all the servants go because Besant said, "Hey, it's not going to happen." Here is actually the obit from when she died, and it just says, "Widow of attorney, was member of old Philadelphia family. Mrs. Sarah Wetherill Logan, who with her husband Robert Logan, a retired attorney, established an experimental art colony on their estate, Sorovia, a decade ago." She died after a brief illness. Sorovia and the story of Sorovia, I'm going to give as many details as I can here tonight, but there's something quite unique about it. I consider it the first, in-depth theosophical attempt there in Pennsylvania to establish a colony, an intentional community that had the direct backing of Besant. This is Deborah Logan, and this ties into something very interesting. She was very unusual, very interested in language, and very interested in esoteric subjects. Deborah Logan had an unusual relationship with her parents, and at a certain point, they considered her visions and things to be signs of her having mental illness, which is really interesting considering the kind of way that she was raised. That's more of Logan with his wife. And you can see she has the snake around her neck, and then he's in the native garb again. And we have to remember that he was, she was basically from an incredibly wealthy family, and here he was, this Wall Street lawyer. And here they are in full mystery school garb at Sorovia, once again. At Sorovia, we also find statues of Bastet, which is the cat goddess. So apparently some cat worship there. I'm sure you can relate.
Yes, Charles Marlowe wanted to know, DJ, what about the cat mystery schools? They are a thing, are they not?
It certainly is. Well, the thing is, at Sorovia, there are incredible statues of cats all along the way. So if you were looking for cat mysticism, it's deep in there. Let's spend a little time with Deborah Logan. And unfortunately, she had a tragic ending. But I want to show this picture of her parents beneath the picture, a carving of Humpty Dumpty. And again, Sorovia was covered in this Alice in Wonderland style. They had fountains of Alice in Wonderland, and the Humpty Dumpty sculpture, I think, is also very unusual. I have a close-up of it as it is today. It's still there. And obviously, we know the deep occult significance of the Humpty Dumpty story, and we've done that in an episode that was all about Alice in Wonderland.
DJ,
Yes.
writer Lee West says Sorovia is not listed in Wikipedia. How did you hear of it?
Isn't that interesting? Well, you have to be a dark journalist to find these things. It is not something that's very widely known. But if you go deeply and you look for connections that relate to Annie Besant and Krishnamurti, you'll find all sorts of magic things. But that's a great question. I do recommend, it's not a for print book by Bergeron. Mike Bergeron, he wrote this, I guess he was kind of obsessed with Sorovia, and he felt maybe he had lived there or something like that. So he wrote a really nice just Kindle version of it that's right up there that you can read. I read it in a day, and I was fascinated all the way through. It was just quite interesting. But I think that Sorovia is a real connection with a kind of mystery school colony that they were attempting there. And I think that there's a lot of information that the mystery schools get from these little setups. Remember, the Gurdjieff school said that their members didn't go above 100. This is something that Gurdjieff said about groups studying the system. They weren't looking for worldwide fame in large groups. They wanted a contained number of people. And I find that interesting, and I feel like in these smaller groups, if we dissect what was going on with them, if we kind of analyze it and go deep, we're going to get some very interesting revelations. I pointed out what they were saying about the sundial. I just want to read what Bergeron wrote in relation to this. He said, an unexplained magnetic force on the east side of the eastern sundial slot had an adverse effect on the compass, yet on the west side, the instrument acts normally. This is that kind of apotheum effect around these things, and I think that Logan was engaged in experiments that might almost be like Coral Castle style magnetic changes. And then what he says is, I performed the same test on the western sundial's face, but no irregularity occurred, leading me to question, why does it act so strangely on the eastern side? The answer to that is left up to the reader's imagination, but he goes in to the different experiments that he does, and I find that section fascinating. So if you get the back of the book, definitely read that. Now, Deborah Logan is going to get us into something very interesting here. Deborah went to Hollywood in 1920. During 1920, while in Ventura, California, Deborah met her future husband, George Starr, with 2 R's, White. Dr. White, a physician whose practice of alternative therapy attracted Sarah Logan, her mother, to him. The elder Logan introduced her daughter to White, who was the future author of a 1929 publication entitled The Guiding Power or Plan of the Universe, A Marvelous Revelation of Life After Death. A very strange, very deep, off-the-wall, esoteric tone. The couple married in 1922. Deborah was 22. White was 55, at least a decade older than Robert Logan, which infuriated Logan. The doctor had been married previously and widowed under mysterious circumstances, according to newspaper clipping. His daughter Marion was 5 when White married Deborah a year after the death of the child's mother. The girl's new stepmother reportedly adopted the youngster. Let's look at Dr. White. This is the book. And let me tell you, this is a very strange piece of work. It comes out in the late 20s. Dr. White has one of the largest clientele in Los Angeles at the time. And someone who was shuttling her family around at that time was the mother of someone named Richard Keenanger. And this woman was involved with a group called the Lemurian Fellowship, who also comes up here tonight. So I'm going to get into some of this now. And while I'm checking that out, Miss Olivia?
Debbie McAdoo says, does Humpty Dumpty represent the portal through the sun, cracking the cosmic egg, the shell between the worlds? Dan Winter describes the act of Kundalini to form the beak that breaks the cosmic egg.
Oh, that is really interesting. Well, Humpty Dumpty definitely has a lot of fragility references. But Humpty Dumpty shows up unusually when he is reenacted in the Alice Mysteries. And that's the kind of the aspect of Humpty Dumpty that I think is more fascinating.
And Chi-Chi would say, meditate on it. See what comes to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is interesting, I think, what you're saying about the egg, too. All right, now, let's meet a couple of doctors here. Is there a doctor in the house? Dr. Stell. Very interesting indeed. Dr. Robert Stell, 1881 to 1952, he was the leader of the Lemurian Fellowship Mystery School. Now, one of the tenets of the Lemurian Fellowship was this outline of Lemurian principles. And we all know that Lemuria is the counterpart to Atlantis, and that Lemuria had its own kind of mystery tradition and its own refugees from that culture when it sank. And a lot of that goes to the west coast of America, a lot of it goes to Asia. One of the things in the Casey readings in relation to Lemuria and Mu, which is the name of this culture, is that one of the remnants here in America of Lemuria were the totem poles that the Native Americans used in the Northwest. Dr. Stell was deeply spiritual, naturally clairvoyant, and felt he had all these contacts with these Lemurian mystery brotherhoods. We can say whether or not he did, but this was the information he was getting. And that whole thing about Mount Shasta and Lemuria largely comes from this Lemurian Fellowship. People go to Mount Shasta today, and there's this whole rumor that the Lemurians went there and they lived underground, and Mount Shasta and all the rest. It's a very spiritual location, there's no question about it, and the stories you can accept or not. But nonetheless, Dr. Stell was giving this kind of doctrine to the world and giving the Lemurian Fellowship principles, and it was all about economics and spiritual balance and all these different things. It was a very in-depth philosophy that he was presenting there in all the way through the 1940s. Now, somebody who was around in this period was the mother of this Richard Kininger, and she was really wrapped up in all of this work, and she actually wanted her son to know all about this. Kininger would eventually write this phenomenal book called The Ultimate Frontier. And so many of us on the mystery school side and in the spiritual side have seen this book over the years. It's one of those classics that really gets into, it was early out of the gate. 1963 is when it was released. In fact, the anniversary of when it was written, I found out, was yesterday.
Wow.
So happy 60th anniversary to the book. And it's claimed to be written by Eklal Kushana. In fact, that's Kininger's pseudonym. And there were a lot of interesting kind of odd things that Kininger did around this. Kininger himself is a very complex figure, and that's a picture of him actually holding the book. But in fact, the scandals and things about Kininger aside, I want to get into some of the aspects of the book. But Kininger had the kind of the fingerprints of a couple of different things. On one hand, he had a lot of human failings, and he screwed up his own attempt to start a mystery school. On the other hand, he seemed to be psychically in touch with this whole Lemurian Fellowship group. Now, what happens is Dr. Stell dies kind of prematurely, or no one expected it, and the Lemurian Fellowship doesn't know what to do. But what's happened in the meantime is there's someone who was very largely impressionable, Keenanger, who was brought there so much by his mother over the years that he absorbed all this information. Now, a few of the things that we learned about Keenanger is he had a photographic memory, and he absorbed information incredibly well. He was incredibly smart in school, but he was isolated growing up there in Illinois by the different people at his school, kind of alienated him as sort of a smart geek in essence. So he developed kind of an unbalanced way of dealing with things. And what happened was he started to apply the philosophy that he had learned. He had been kicked out of the Lemurian Fellowship for writing articles imitating their work without giving the credit back to Dr. Stell and the incredible things that he laid out there. So what he does is he starts something called the Stell community. And Stell, depending on which translation you want, means either place or star. So it's the star community or it's the place. And in the book, he outlines in The Ultimate Frontier this incredible relationship with this brotherhood of mystery schools, which are saying that he has to prepare and create this colony, very much like Serovia. But this one is going to be technologically sustainable, and it will get through the incredible devastation of the United States, and it'll get through this kind of Armageddon conditions. He'll attract the great scientists, and all these different things will happen there in the Stell community. Now, in there, they also outline that the Lemurians were this advanced group and that they had this incredible culture, and that all of the outlines of their system will be enacted in this Stell community. And that there's all this combination with Atlantis, and they tell Keenanger, you know, you were Akhenaten. I mean, the story gets higher and higher and higher. And it's written in a way of these figures showing up. But one of the very interesting figures that shows up initially, before anything gets started, he's like a 12-year-old boy in the book, is Dr. White comes along and gives him all this information about spirituality and brotherhood. Now, it could very well be, and there is some speculation here, that what happened was Keenanger had a vision problem when he was younger, and White had a book out about how to improve your vision. Like, he had these special methods, and White used all kinds of unusual things like aura reading tools and lights, but he was actually very advanced on the holistic side, as strange a character as he was. Now remember, Dr. White is married to Deborah Logan, the young daughter of the Logans at Serovia. And so now we have our friend Keenanger talking all about this Dr. White, who shows up and gives him all this advice and tells him all about his past lives and everything else. And then in the middle of that book is this big outline of the Lemurian Fellowship material. And then he calls the community Stell. So it's all basically through and through one thing that we're talking about, which is Keenanger is taking all that information that Dr. Stell got from the Lemurian Fellowship Mystery School that he founded, and all this information that he got from this Dr. White, who was married to Deborah Logan, and he is formulating an entire philosophy out of it. And it's actually seems incredibly deep and unusual, because what he's doing is he's drawing on two very major mystery school traditions. If in fact Keenanger had been chosen by these mystery schools, if that had been the case, then they would have been disappointed with some of the activities that he got up to later. But it is interesting, the Stell story has always been strange. And one of the main things that they put forward were they were going to develop these airships in order to survive these cataclysms. And this was one of the key things around the Stell community, which was just outside of Chicago, about 30 miles outside of Chicago, but basically kind of in the middle of nowhere. Now, Stell is there now as like a real estate community. It's not really the Stell group so much anymore. That's kind of gone on over time. But a lot of those people who were in the Stell group came forward and talked about trying to develop an intentional community there. One of the amazing things that they ended up doing was developing their own phone system outside of the regular phone system. And that community only grew to about 200 people, where in the book he says it's going to grow to be this, 200,000 people or something like that. So there's a lot of weird left turns that Kininger takes as he goes along. One of the interesting people who comes out of that group, Stell, you may recognize him, it's David Hatcher Childress. And I'll tell you an interesting thing about Childress, which is he co-owned a travel business with Kininger. And that's where that whole Adventures Unlimited stuff, well, it was these ancient mystery tour type things. And we're talking about a really young Hatcher Childress, because this is in the 80s. So just to get us wrapped around this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 100, Part 2, going deep, deep on Steiner, Stell, and Serobia, getting to the mystery school reveal here as we move through this. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program. That's coming up, so I got to hustle here. And you can ask them all in caps. Miss Olivia, how you doing out there?
Great. Gigi just joined us.
Excellent. So this is definitely a Gigi show.
Exactly. Mount Cleverest wants to know, DJ, is Serobia Atlantean or Lemurian?
No, I would definitely say that the Stell work is supposed to be part of that Lemurian Fellowship Mystery School. I would actually call Serobia as more out of that sort of theosophical Atlantean tradition. And, the way that I look at it is these were small scale versions where the mystery schools were really watching the results of what was happening with the human interaction here, and if the people involved in those communities were advancing, et cetera. And I think that they were working with different teachers to try to get those results. I think Logan tried very hard with his intentional community, and I think it had a lot of support, as we saw from both Besant and Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti went there on a regular basis, so he obviously thought very highly of it. As an intentional community, it's still very unknown, so there's a lot for us to know there. One of the things about Kininger I have to mention is that they started to, after he founded Stell in the 70s, the book became a big hit and all the rest. Then they started to say, well, Stell's an apocalyptic society. And so it got a lot of bad press, et cetera. The New York Times covered it. The apocalypse never happened, but a community did. This is kind of extensive coverage for mainstream media to get in on this very small group. 85 miles south of Chicago, where farmland rolls out to the horizon in every direction, sits the tiny community of Stell. At first glance, it resembles a typical residential subdivision of ranch houses, but a brief history is remarkable. Proclaimed as the precursor to the Kingdom of God by Richard Kininger, the guru-like founder, Stell began as a spiritual commune intended to survive an apocalyptic event. As that dark vision faded, the town became a vibrant outpost of the sustainability movement and evolved into an open community of 100 or so good neighbors. That number 100, again. This is very interesting because I will say this, The Ultimate Frontiers is an innovation as a book because it talks about the deep mystery tradition. It talks about, Atlantis and Lemuria, and it talks about the collapse of the United States, and it talks about the incredible destruction, cataclysm aspect, and how they need to build airships to survive. And it talks all about sustainability, and then it also talks about land rising, not in the Atlantic this time, but in the Pacific, and that's where they're going to create this new community. It's very unusual. The sophistication lies in that it's drawing on this Lemurian Fellowship information. But Kininger himself starts to become a very strange character in all this. And I think there is a mystery school connection as much as there's a lot of puffery going on with Kininger and a lot of strange activities and a lot of activities that will eventually get him booted out of Stell, interestingly enough. By the way, more coverage on that. Kininger will start another community called Adelphi when he's thrown out of Stell. And a utopian society built in Texas town in 1984 to survive the end of the world there he is again now, setting up a Delphi and getting this coverage of being like the Apocalypse Man, which is kind of different than the Ultimate Frontier started out as. There's an article, very interesting article, about Richard Kininger and UFOs, and I'm going to get into a little bit of it here. In the October 1970 issue of his newsletter Anomaly, John Keel, who we mentioned very much on this program, mentioned the contactee experiences of Richard Kininger, founder of the Stell Group and the community Stell not far from Chicago, Illinois. In Keel's view, this was another example of the manipulative elementals playing games with a credulous victim. I bought the book Ultimate Frontier, written by Kininger under the pen name Iqbal Kushana, and was immediately fascinated by his claims of being contacted by a secret brotherhood, especially as this brotherhood was said to use anti-gravity aircraft, flying saucers, as part of their activities. Again, I think the book is kind of innovative for the period that it's in. Remember, it came out in '63. In 1979, I entered several years of correspondence with various representatives of Stell, Heather Norris, and Kininger himself. I subscribed to their newsletter and acquired as much data and material as I could from the group. There was one essay, Space Vehicles and Travelers, written by Richard Kininger. I found it profoundly intriguing. Written in 1966, it stated regarding flying saucers, some are interplanetary vehicles, others are of earthly origin. The ones which are from this planet are saucer-shaped, generally trapezoidal cross-section with 3 hemispherical engine pods on the underside. They were first developed by man on this planet about 20,000 years ago and have been used by members of the lesser brotherhoods continuously since that time.
Okay, wait, you lost me for a second. Who said that?
That's Kininger's quote.
Oh, okay.
And he's talking and saying that UFOs are actually ancient Lemurian technology and Atlantean technology that's still being used. Which again, in 1963, I think is a pretty edgy thing to be saying. Well, that's 66. So I'm going to kind of get past some of the other pieces of this.
Can I insert a question
Yes.
right here? It'd be perfect.
Absolutely.
So Vern Baumgarten wanted to know, is it possible that the mystery schools have a connection with extraterrestrials? And Ray Story wants to know, are aliens in Switzerland the real puppet masters? If so, is the deep state agenda controlled by non-terrestrial powers? And for how long has this been going on? So let's get into it.
I'm thinking about Switzerland. There's a lot of things to cover in
Yes,
Switzerland.
there is.
I mean, the Billy Meyer story comes out of Switzerland.
Exactly.
But the BIS and CERN and all that here. I can at least answer the mystery school part with the UFO thing. If you go in the theosophical tradition, go along. By the time you get to the UFO thing, all of the participants, Adamski, all the different people who came forward were all theosophists. So they were trained and ready for this, for sure, on the spiritual side, as opposed to just saying the mystery school is using advanced technology. Whatever the UFO phenomena represents and whatever's in the UFO file, the mystery schools, the Theosophical Society readied these people. They trained them. And so that by the time you get to Adamski and all that, the big 50s contactees, they're all deeply in that tradition of the mystery schools, especially Theosophy. So there's a huge crossover there. There's no question about it. A little bit more on this. And this is Walter Cox, who knew, he was close to Kininger for many years, and the interviews were with the different Stell residents and stuff. But Cox went deep because he knew Kininger. And what he said was, to sum up, I would say that Kininger showed less respect for truth than any person I ever met. He lied about everything, large and small. He lied when there was no reason to lie. He lied to avoid the natural repercussions of his actions. He lied to his wife, his many girlfriends, his daughter, and every friend he ever had. Does that mean I think the philosophy of the ultimate frontier is false? No, I think the philosophy itself is sound, and I'm thankful Richard wrote the book. It's very interesting. Whenever you get around Kininger and his work with independent, setting up these communities, there's always a firestorm of controversy around Kininger, and he's always eventually thrown out for lying, for misconduct, whatever it happens to be. So he has that trail to him, and it would seem like, oh, this is just some cult leader, et cetera, et cetera. But the story goes a little bit deeper. So, in Ramona, California, which is outside of San Diego, this is where so much of the Lemurian Fellowship thrived. And they did write letters, kind of cease and desist type letters to Kininger to stop using the philosophy, because they considered the material that Dr. Stell got from a legitimate mystery school. So when Kininger was thrown out of these different schools, they would come in, the Lemurian Fellowship would come in and work with Stell and work with Adelphi and say, don't worry about him, we'll take care of him, but we'll work with you on the principles, etc. And the idea was not so much that Kininger was an outright fraud, but that he was somebody who was initiated into a process and then bailed out and became a classic cult leader type. And he, suffered real consequences, and people were incredibly disappointed in him, especially the ones who bought into the incredible philosophy of the ultimate frontier. And we've known a lot of people over the years who are really into that book and the tradition. What I can say about that book is, because it weighs so heavily on Dr. Stell's original work, there is, regardless of Kininger's inconsistencies and bizarre behavior, the book itself actually revealed some things. But let's go into an interesting thing that might open up the bit about Kininger and might let us see what was going on there with Stell. So there's someone named Victor who was at Stell throughout the time that Kininger was there and afterwards, and he sustained the community. His name is Victor, and he spent many years of hard work at Stell. He began worrying about the validity of working for Stell and all the things that he had done. And so he voiced a prayer: dear God and dear brotherhoods, if you exist, please let me know if this community is for real. Please let me know if I'm just wasting my time here, if I've risked my family and everything else for nothing. Please let me know if Richard Kininger has been telling the truth and if I should stay. Victor went to sleep the next morning and awoke to a telephone call. The voice on the other end of the phone said, hello, I'm calling in reference to your questions for more information about Richard Kininger and the validity of your presence in Stell. Perhaps we can arrange a meeting. Well, that's one way to get an answer to a prayer, I guess. A date was set, and a few days later, a large Mercedes pulled up in front of Victor's house. Victor's a real person, by the way, and this story is completely legit. An elderly Chinese man and a young man of perhaps 15 stepped out. To Victor's surprise, it was the young man, Jim, who did the talking while the Chinese man waited in the car. The young man said it was his first assignment from the Brotherhoods, and he was sent to provide Victor with crucial information. Jim confirmed that Richard Kininger had indeed been contacted by the Brotherhoods as a young man, i.e. mystery schools. But later they came to the conclusion that he would misuse the information they assigned various keepers who tried to limit the damage Richard might cause. Despite Richard's fabrications, Jim said that Stell had gained positive attention for the Brotherhoods and had the potential to develop in the planned direction. Jim encouraged Victor to stay in the community and help provide leadership at a critical juncture. Because of this visit and the information, Victor decided to stay in Stell. In the mid-90s, Victor again began to question the experience with Jim, and with the help of the internet, he succeeded to trace Jim's phone number. Remember, the guy called in response to his prayer, after all. Later, when Victor tried to search, when Victor phoned Jim, he was surprised that he'd been able to find him, but he confirmed the information he had provided some 10 years earlier. Okay, so he was a 15-year-old kid then. He called from a phone number. 10 years later, this guy calls the same phone number. The guy still has that phone number and confirms all the information. Later, when Victor tried to search the internet again using Jim's name, all the information had been deleted. With the help of Walter Cox, I tried to contact Victor by email to confirm the story. Unfortunately, I received no answer, and I've come to understand that Victor is rather reticent regarding this experience. So this, I think, this gets us into some very interesting places, which is that what we're seeing is, and I think that those are unusual figures that are showing up as intermediaries around this, especially since the guy is just psychically making this prayer and then these people show up and call him. And I think the fact that it was an Asian man is interesting as well, because we know so often in the Men in Black stories, they all think that they appear Asian until they look, and we know John Keel did this experiment of showing them Sami people. And over again, people would say, oh yeah, you're right. They weren't Asian, they were Sami. And there's a whole series of episodes we did on the Men in Black that'll give you more information about that. But I think whenever we get around the Kininger story, we have these weird contradictions about, the kind of things that he did. Did he embezzle money? Well, he eventually wound up going to prison for proclaiming the Republic of Texas and writing checks against the Republic of Texas. And he did go to prison, and he got out of that. I think it was an 18-month sentence. But his life really went down hard in general. He lost his connections with Adelphi. He lost his connections with Stell, which are the two communities he started. But he wrote this incredible book synthesizing all this information from Dr. Stell. So the question has always been, was this just a con man, or is this part of a mystery school tradition? Whatever it was, it went wrong, although a lot of people's good intentions in Stell kind of moved some of these things out. So we're left with an interesting story, which is this is an attempt by the mystery schools to create an intentional community, which is what Dr. Stell said was required going into the 21st century. And it was Kininger who picked up the mantle. Obviously, his connection was there in the Lemurian Fellowship, and at a certain point they said, this guy is going to be off the rails. But somehow he got the book out and he got that attention there for the Stell story, which is why I think a number of people are still drawn to the material in that book. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Well, I'm going to ask you, Ed Copeland says, interesting that White's book came out a year after Manly P. Hall's book, Secret Teachings.
Yeah, that's true.
So something was afoot.
Yes. Well, Manly P. Hall also was only 26 when he did that incredible. How do you get a 26-year-old to do that book?
Because he was an initiate, clearly.
Kininger died in 2002, and he put a lot of incredible things on the record, but he left an incredible trail of disappointed people in his various, activities. What I will say in relation to Stell and the Ultimate Frontier, though, is that there's some aspect, we can see some crisscross with the mystery school aspect. And remember, one of the key things that Stell was developed for was to create airships. And that whole UFO piece kind of hangs over the development of that independent community. A quick thing that someone noticed, there's somebody out there who did some research who's just, I was like, they're kind of slicing and dicing up Kininger. And that's one thing. But then they started to be like, and that other fraud, Blavatsky, and, they just go off on everybody. But one of the interesting things I think that they found out was that what we were saying earlier about Stell, the principal and main influence on Kininger in the creation of his fraud was the Lemurian Fellowship. Now, the Lemurian Fellowship was founded in 1936 by Dr. Stell, who was a doctor of osteopathy, by the way, and Howard John Zitko. At the time they founded their religion, Zitko and Stell claimed to have acquired the teachings of the lost continent of Mu in papers which Zitko found. Later in his life, this Zitko character becomes, I think, very interesting because it's the Lemurian Fellowship teaching lessons that form the kind of basis for the whole Stell philosophy. So we have there a mystery school that kind of went off the rails there. And, it's interesting. By contrast, if you look at the anthroposophical approach, there's been such incredible success and integrity with the work that's gone forward from Steiner. Theosophy had also its kind of train wrecks along the way. And we have had, again, these later versions of schools. One of the ones I want to turn to here is Elizabeth Clare Prophet, just briefly.
Wow.
But before we get into her, Miss Olivia?
Twilight Mist wants to know, in the Stell Star community, do you think this is prophetic of the star children coming in nowadays? Unbeknownst to them, they did trigger society to think along these lines after all.
This
So-
is very interesting because you get into a key area that I've thought before, which is a lot of these things that happened too early. And, we've talked before about John Lennon grabbing up lots in the Atlantic Ocean and Ernest Hemingway's brother thinking Atlantis was going to rise based on the Casey readings and the Hemingway family working with the Caseys. But I think that what they were seeing, they were too ready, and they were ahead of the mark, and they didn't realize that this was kind of a gradual process, and it wasn't like, that instant gratification that Atlantis will rise and all this stuff will be revealed. The whole process of this kind of disclosure has taken a long, long, long time. And here we are in 2021, and these things are starting to open up. But we can see that the Stell group planted a seed for sure with that story. And the seed may not have even come from Kininger. It's probably from Dr. Stell's original work. But it is fascinating when you dig through it and you say, all throughout the book in The Ultimate Frontier, they talk about black mentalists throwing off these different developments in society that are moving things along. And then you look at Stell, and it really seems like something that should have been a success as an independent community, and instead gets thrown off the rails because Kininger starts to act like a lunatic. That seems like, the warning about black mentalists in the beginning of that book kind of says everything.
I forgot that term. Black mentalist,
I do
really
think
good term.
it does. It says a lot. There's no question about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. This is X Series 100 Part 2, Steiner, Stell, and Sorobia. I didn't mention Elizabeth Clare Prophet in the open, but she comes up in this because, again, she is an offshoot of this mystery school piece, and she goes far beyond Alice Bailey's era and all that. She died in 2009, and the Church Triumphant is out there still. The Summit Lighthouse people are still out there in Montana, and I'm going to tell you some weird things about the location that they're in also. This is Elizabeth Clare Prophet, very interesting. She actually went to school right here in Boston at BU, and she met Mark Prophet, who was about 30 years older than she was and was already married. And she was 22, I think, when she met him. And they had some kind of an incredible love at first sight thing. But Mark Prophet saw himself as the communicator on Earth for Saint Germain and his brotherhood. And he had gone to Washington, D.C. to set up the Summit Lighthouse. And the Summit Lighthouse was basically another mystery school idea. And he was giving these lectures and channeling and things of this nature. Now, Elizabeth Clare Prophet had unusual seizures and things when she was younger. And they thought that she was epileptic, but there was something kind of religious stigmata-ish about it. And so we knew that she was going to have this kind of unusual future. Her dad was in the German Navy and was actually questioned as a Nazi spy. So she had a strange background right off the bat. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, though, she brought forward this idea that the Ascended Masters were trying to preserve America. And there's a very big key in this because that shows up in Kininger's work also. And I want to address this strain of the mystery activity, which is all about setting up the American nation. And there's a lot of mystery school activity around the Constitution and Washington and Franklin. They're deeply involved with the mystery schools of different levels, some lesser schools and others. But when you get into about the 60s and early 70s, there's an incredible wave of kind of patriotic mystery school activity that you can start to track. And in particular, Mark Prophet was warning about communist activity. he had actually gone on a tour and talked with different leaders of the world who did have him as an audience. And I have some pictures of him with Indira Gandhi and so on. Something weird was going on with this movement. And we can see these mystery schools become incredibly big, actually. The Elizabeth Clare Prophet's Church Triumphant started to get quite big. Now, interestingly enough, Prophet himself dies. Mark Prophet. That's a shot of Mark Prophet and Indira Gandhi, by the way, which I find interesting that she received him an audience. She's the Prime Minister of India. This is a picture of Prophet marrying Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Elizabeth Clare Prophet would come out channeling the work of Saint Germain and giving, the audience all of these different revelations about these, kind of in the vein of Blavatsky, in the vein of Theosophy, but definitely, again, moved into that Western tradition and with a really hardcore Save America type of mindset, which I find absent in the earlier works, but certainly, as I mentioned, the American Revolution, etc. So what happens at a certain point is she says, I'm going to move everything that Mark set up in Washington, D.C. and California, which was getting really large. And where does she decide to move it to? She moves it all out to a place called Livingston, Montana. Now, Livingston, Montana is very interesting because it's featured almost accidentally featured in a Casey reading. And this is Edgar Casey's reading. He's talking to some guy who's from Livingston, Montana, and he sort of says, oh yeah, by the way, it might be a good idea to buy some granaries and things up there because, in fact, Livingston, Montana must someday feed the world. And there's not a lot of follow-up from the guy on it, oddly enough. But later, someone asks Casey, oh, you said something about Livingston, Montana. And Casey mentions it again. He says, oh, yeah, Livingston, Montana, along with portions of South Africa, must someday feed the world. So Elizabeth Clare Prophet moves the Church Universal and Triumphant right out there to Livingston, Montana. So again, we have a mystery school aspect with Casey bringing forward this information, which lays out there, but apparently gets picked up by Elizabeth Clare Prophet. And then it begs the question from us now, so many years later, in 2021, looking at this and saying, what is it about Livingston, Montana that would have it feeding the world? We can only imagine with Earth changes or whatever, what Casey was talking about. But Clare Prophet took it very seriously, enough to move her entire outfit out there. Well, when she does, she gets incredible flack from the media all of a sudden, because what they hear is that she's getting more and more patriotic, and she's saying we need to build America back up and we need to be prepared to fight communism and things of this nature. And for some reason, they really decide she's target number one. And she is on all of these major shows going after her, Nightline's going after her. And I found the New York Times article, Gun Guru's Bomb Shelter Hits Legal Snag. They did not want this woman setting up her headquarters there in Livingston, whoever these forces in the media were. A little bit from this article. On the day when she predicted the likely outbreak of nuclear war, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, a guru who says she speaks for God, was besieged by the concerns of a secular world alarmed at what she had brought to Paradise Valley. A judge in nearby Livingston ordered a halt to construction on the site of a huge underground bomb shelter as cleanup crews worked to remove fuel that had leaked from storage tanks near the headquarters of Miss Prophet's church. Mrs. Prophet, likening the shelter to a Noah's Ark in the earth, said in an interview that the elaborate plan for her and her followers to survive a nuclear war would continue despite today's legal setback. This is all very interesting. Mrs. Prophet declared that today marked the beginning of 12 years of intense negative karma that would bring the four horsemen of the apocalypse galloping near. More specifically, a nuclear war could break out any minute. She said members of her church, Universal and Triumphant, including 750 staff members and about 2,000 other people who live in this Rocky Mountain Valley borderline Yellowstone National Park, would not go underground unless war broke out. So she's getting ready. We're not moles, said Mrs. Prophet, who said she had no more control over the people who live in the church's 30,000-acre property than does the average head of a corporation. The church, whose adherents call Mrs. Prophet Guru Ma and says she speaks for God, again, they're inserting that. She speaks for God. She speaks for God. Not really. She is channeling ascended masters. I think it's kind of different. So they go pretty hardcore with this whole thing, and then they try to annihilate her plans for creating these bomb shelters. And then they start to say, oh, she thinks she's Marie Antoinette in the past life, like she's a lunatic. And they basically move there to just destroy basically anything that she is doing there in Montana. And it does take an incredible hit. And she gets a lot of incredibly bad press. People come out with tell-all books and all that kind of thing. Although Prophet, I would say generally, it seems from all impressions of looking into that stuff, was not even that much of a control freak. It looks to me literally like she was trying to get that whole, like, what do you do with this mystery school knowledge? So she becomes an unusual case because she did create incredible gardens and things. She brought together this incredible community. And if you talk to various people who were associated with different cults and things like that, the people who were associated with the Church Triumphant, although there are a few people who talk about, they had guns or whatever, in general, actually, most of the hype, they're always amazed that there was so much negative hype around Elizabeth Clare Prophet. And I have to say, I think that they were really targeting her because these groups on the left-hand side who work through the media, they know about the Livingston, Montana prediction too, and they couldn't afford to have her up there with her mystery school knowledge.
Catherine Harris says Jay-Z Knight has property in Montana, yes?
It's in Washington.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and J.C. Knight, that's very interesting. That's another unusual and interesting story. I actually interviewed J.C. Knight in 2016, and it's here on this channel, and it was a crazy, wild ride and very informative, actually. But no, I enjoyed talking with her. I think what we're seeing is that a lot of these pieces on the Mystery School chessboard, sometimes when they play out, aren't exactly what they seem to us on the surface. So when people think now of Elizabeth Clare Prophet, they'll think, oh yeah, that apocalypse bomb nut or whatever. But what really was she doing? Was she picking up the mantle of groups like Sarobia, trying to start an intentional community as Besant and Krishnamurti had instructed them to do? It is quite fascinating. With that, Miss Olivia?
Esoteric 369 Wall wants to know, her Ascended Masters, ours, what is an Ascended Master, please?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, it comes out of that theosophical tradition. Okay, it's really Blavatsky who mentioned this, that there were these advanced beings who had gone through all of their incarnations here on Earth and wanted to just help humanity reach to this other level that they reside on. They can be physical if they want to be. They basically exist as a kind of enlightened etheric body. But what's interesting is Blavatsky identified them, Saint Germain, Lord Maitreya, all these different ones. And you can tell that she's really locked in to this. And I always take Blavatsky's information very, very seriously. What Steiner said is that he found it interesting that they focused so much on these masters in the theosophical tradition, because that's kind of a background thing, because they're not meant to step in for humanity. They're meant there to be outside in the background, just helping humanity along. So the idea that they suddenly became the center of theosophy, he found very unusual. And he also felt that there was a game of imitation that was going on with some of the beings projecting themselves and imitating some of these larger figures. But in the case of Blavatsky, she'd had this Lord Moria, who was appearing to her as a master from the time she was in her teens. So this is part of her spiritual journey. What the Ascended Masters idea means for us, obviously, in these traditions, is that there are these beings that have kind of conquered the physical plane and are moving along, trying to help humanity get on that track as well. So that's really what they are. Yes.
A cult fan says, what is the difference between Ascended Masters and possible deceptive sublunar forces, and how can we tell the difference? And don't pass the buck to Gigi.
Gigi, we should pipe Gigi in right now for that. Here's the way I look at it. There's a lot of deception when it comes to these realms. And, so you have to hone your abilities. Just like in the media, the media will sit there and spit out all this ridiculous nonsense, right? And if you were just somebody who consumed the media, and we talk to them all the time, these people who are just, they consume the media and they don't understand the things that we're talking about because they've been zombified by this CNN and MSNBC and all the rest of it. And so all those people will ever think is like, oh, Trump's a fascist and anyone who follows him is like a fascist and all that kind of stuff. Or they'll think, Bill Gates is trying to help America get healthy and strong. It's because they've been fed this junk by manipulated media. None of those things are true. So you already have to hone yourself just in this world around the things that we're talking about in the mainstream media on a day-to-day basis. When it comes to this higher level, it's an excellent question. How do you tell the difference? But I would say that a lot of it has to do on that end of the spectrum with feeling. And you always know after a spiritual experience, what's going on. So I'd go back to feeling on that one. It's a less intellectual exercise.
Yeah, Jay Mallet says, who are you? That's the real question that matters. I mean, ultimately, it's know thyself, right?
I'm dark journalist. Yes, no, it's true. It all comes down to where are you coming from. And then we also get into a place where we have to say, wait a minute, how well do I know myself, right? And the words over the incredible Greek mystery school were know thyself. That's it. And so the way you do that in the Gurdjieff work is you study the different centers of the body. In the Steiner work, you study your conscious self studies the spiritual reality. So you don't go into a trance, you apprehend it as part of your conscious mind. And in Theosophy, I would say, they have a series of different things of how to be a Theosophist, in essence. But a lot of it has to do with energy. A lot of it has to do with energy. Yes.
Everything's energy. Okay, so let's talk about Gurdjieff for a minute. Bluebird says, yes. Gurdjieff rejected the feminine principle. Nothing can be achieved without the participation of both principles.
Well, I don't know if that's true, actually, because later in the 30s, he created a group called Rope, which it was interesting because he let women into his inner circle of activity. But if you go back into meetings with remarkable men, in his searches originally, there's a very interesting woman who works with like the secret life of plants, and she teaches him about vibration, and she is along for all of those journeys. So I think that, Gurdjieff in the era, we're talking the early 20th century, he's not going to be as enlightened as somebody is now about these types of things. But I feel like he had a place, it's interesting. I was just reading about how Steiner in like the 1890s was a suffragist. He was already very far ahead of the curve. And whenever they would come up with these different issues, he said, if they're women's issues, women should talk about them and decide on them. That was in 1895. So some of these people were advanced beyond their time for sure. But I think there's a female mystery tradition. There's no question about it. And Dion Fortune's work gets very deep into the brotherhoods. I think it is interesting that a lot of the problems with the Theosophical Society come about when she tries to join the American mystery schools. And Steiner looks at that and he says it's because of the incredible grip of the political situation in America with the wrong part of the mystery schools. So those secret societies wanted to take American politics in a certain direction, and they didn't want this upstart idealist who actually was mystery school trained to join. So it is interesting to look back on it. Can we imagine what it was like in 1875 to be a Russian woman and trying to be taken seriously in all these different circles? I mean, it's kind of remarkable, her journey, if you think about it. Yes.
Ed Kaufman, do high-level mystery school people, quote, walk among us, much in the same way as certain human-looking aliens?
Oh, yeah. In all the different traditions, there are mystery school people who have regular everyday jobs, but just are a part of this larger thing. And again, the mystery schools have different levels. So, on that ascended master style level, again, they're operating in etheric bodies, right? So Saint Germain, for example, would be 500 years old or something like that. I don't think he has a regular job. But yeah, that whole idea, I always go back to an interesting Edgar Cayce story when he was giving these readings and his dad had taken over with another guy, Ketchum, who was a doctor actually, but they had decided on their own that at the end of the readings, they were going to ask him questions relating to gambling, things like that, to try to get psychic information on horse races and things. And Cayce was walking around. He felt terrible. He had migraines. He was useless, and he had low energy, and he could barely speak. He just could not figure out what the problem was. So this strange guru showed up in his office, and he came up to him and he put his hand on his wrist and he said, "You're with the wrong people." And he looked so exotic that Cayce was like, what's going on here? And Cayce would see him a few times in his life at pivotal points, but he left. And then Cayce went out and said, "Did you see which way he went?" And nobody had seen this guy. So he had this apparition of this guru master. And he figured out, and he made them confess that they were doing this thing with the gambling and the readings. And what they were doing was, when the reading was over, they were getting this extra psychic information. But because of their intent, it was wrecking his entire energetic structure, because he was built to give out this healing information, and they were making him do other things with it. So I think that's a kind of it's pretty interesting when we start to look at how these things can be physical. They can go from the etheric plane directly into the physical. And that gets pretty woo-woo for some people. But then again, we've heard all kinds of strange stories. We've heard stories from firemen seeing angels who led them out of fires and things like that. We have the capacity in there for much deeper type of sense knowledge. I don't think there's any question about it. I think that's a lot of what the mystery school message is. Yes, Ms.
Ninjat Madri, any chance Trump is part of these mystery schools? We have gotten this question a lot.
Listen, Trump was very deep with Norman Vincent Peale. And Norman Vincent Peale knew a lot. And he was part of the New Thought aspect. So they know how to control things by thinking a certain way. So that gets you in the general ballpark. And I've always thought there's more to Trump than any of the kind of buffoonery that is ascribed to him in the media. And I always go back to the point in the media that they're so deathly afraid of Trump that you have to wonder, it's a lot deeper than just a political issue for them. They live in a kind of perpetual fear of the rise of someone like Trump. And for, however you want to view Trump, their reaction to him, I think, maybe says a lot.
Yeah, the other thing is, ultimately, if everything's consciousness, Trump is
Trump is consciousness.
He is a single-minded man, he is, even
Yeah.
say what you want about him, but his focus on what he wants, I mean, this is willpower
True.
ultimately. And this is why New Agers don't get anything and that they want in life, because
I think that's true.
because Carolyn Mace always says you need to develop a backbone instead of a wishbone. They wish, but they're not but they don't have willpower and they don't have discipline and they're not single-minded. In many ways, they're too compassionate. They're always thinking about other people and they're considering this and that. When you are a narcissist, you can be incredibly single-minded. It's just about you and getting what you want. And that's a consciousness. And you can manifest that consciousness much more easily than someone who is always debating and considering and self-doubting and all of that. So I would say, I mean, Trump doesn't need to be part of a mystery school. He has a benefit of a single-minded consciousness.
Yeah. Oh, there's no question. There's no question about that. There are some people who are just, they're born to be in the game. And he's somebody who is in history. So it's very interesting to me that the entire American political system, the world political system, just flipped their lid at Donald Trump. But we'll have to see what the future holds on that. I will say this. When we look at what I was talking about with the Mystery Schools Rescuing America theme, remember the Stell Group has this also. So in the Stell Group's position, again, it's a kind of communism. We are facing this communism now. I don't think they knew what it was going to look like or how it was going to be. But the Chinese Communist Party and their undue influence on American politics is becoming, laughable. It's a freak show, and it's a terribly dangerous situation politically. So, we have to say this while embracing Chinese people and Chinese culture, but the government is absolutely vicious in terms of what they want, and they keep their citizens in absolute, and I mean absolute, terrifying social credit score conditions. And if you say anything against that regime, you're done. So that's what they want to do here. And there's an incredible danger with it. Of course, we had Eric Swalwell, who was having an affair, God knows what else it was going on there, with a Chinese spy. And then he's on the Intelligence Committee, and all the Democrats on the Intelligence Committee go to defend this guy. That's a problem. He's a gigantic security risk. So he should be ousted from those positions and investigated. So what's wrong with that function that is not working? And why isn't the media on that? They're paying attention to the story about Matt Gaetz and like his sex background or whatever. I'll tell you, the situation with Swalwell, I would think, is a really big national security thing. And he probably is a link to a bunch of other spies too. So
no doubt.
Yeah. And he's the one, remember, who was like, oh, we should take all the Trump supporters and round them up and stuff. Well, who is this guy? And what was he doing with this Chinese spy? And what was the weirdness around covering that up? I mean, it gets very, very strange. It gets strange with our own president and his relationship to China through his son as well. So, we have a really big, major problem in relation to the CCP. There's no question about it. And now when they introduce things like vaccine passports and things like that, who's behind that? Who's going to be engineering it? These are the questions that we really need to ask. Yes.
Okay, I want to address this. The weed in your garden says the republic is dead. Sorry, guys. I've been thinking about this a lot lately and how many people are saying this, and I understand where they're coming from. But I keep thinking about traditions, sort of like the Native American tradition, when someone is alive as long as they are remembered, right? Memory is very important.
Oh, yeah.
There are many people here who remember the Republic, who remember America.
Yes, absolutely.
And yeah, I know it's like we're in the final days here, but as long as we remember and we keep remembering and we keep summoning that memory,
yes,
and keep it alive within ourselves, it's not dead yet.
No, not by a long shot. I absolutely agree with that. No, again, there are forces that are beyond the control of those who are manipulating so many of our circumstances. There's no question about it. And, you know, the overreach aspect, remember the overreach during the lockdowns and things like that? It's starting to get pretty ugly in terms of the overreach, and they can't see it. Remember, they thought they were going to roll out and have Bill Gates be a great guy and everyone was going to love him, because when you're surrounded by all those, you know, yes men, and you're giving billions of dollars to media companies, they're going to tell you what you want. But then the truth, you know, the rubber met the road when he came out and everyone hated him. I think he's one of the most hated people on the planet, and rightfully so. So you can see how, you know, they get in their own feedback loop about things, and it's far removed from actual reality. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are here, Dark Journalist X Series X100 Part 2, and it's all about going deep on the mystery schools revealed. We've revealed them tonight through the figure of Rudolf Steiner and the group Stell and Serobia, the mysterious Serobia. I have a quick thing to read about Serobia before we go any further. And this is actually out of a Pennsylvania newspaper called the Courier-Times. But just to give us a little more, round out the information about Serobia, I forgot to read this. The 155-acre mansion was the fountainhead of Philadelphia naturalists Robert and Sarah Logan. What's interesting, what I forgot to mention, is Sarah grew up the privileged daughter of the Weller Hill family in Rittenhouse Square. And of course, Rittenhouse comes up very strongly in our episode dealing with all the strangeness around that Venus progression, when everyone was looking to see when Venus was going to be out there back in the late 1700s. In 1915, the newlyweds began purchasing adjoining farmlands along the Delaware River on the Bensalem side of the Neshaminy Creek. They moved into a large manor house on site with a barn converted for an amateur theater. They added an Alice in Wonderland sculpture behind an adobe wall mounted by a large stone Humpty Dumpty. The Logans idolized Egyptian cat goddess Bastet and made their property a haven for felines. Iron statues of two black Egyptian cats and the word Serobia guarded the state road entrance to the compound. The name was a contraction of the first three letters of the couple's first names, Sarah and Robert. As activists in Eastern religions, the couple attracted affluent theosophists. The two took to dressing in white cotton fabrics to symbolize purity and avoided anything made from animals, including leather shoes. Preferred dress was Indian saris and sandals. Among frequent guests in the 1930s were Annie Besant, as we mentioned, president of the International Theosophical Society, and Indian philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti, believed to be the reincarnated next world teacher. So again, just to kind of round out the thing about the Logans, you know, we have people there very deep in society. And I think when we talk about the mystery school influence, let's not forget that the mystery school side of what we're seeing going on with America, that those groups are watching also, and they're looking to see how they can use smaller groups to raise awareness. I'm sure that they're very engaged in things like promoting biodynamic farming, because this is going to be a very crucial thing, as well as early childhood education. I forgot to mention when talking about Elizabeth Clare Prophet that she was the one who got the Montessori schools going. And those are so innovated along with the Waldorf schools that the Steiner people got going. So that early advanced childhood development comes directly out of mystery school movements. Interestingly enough, yes.
Hold on, I just had it. Mount Cleverest. Daniel, which of the ways in the schools are most centered upon the New Atlantis or Eighth Sphere?
Well, the Eighth Sphere is a real mystery because it came out accidentally, apparently, because Steiner said it was one of the biggest secrets of all in the mystery schools. And it was very kind of blithely let out by A.P. Sinnott, who mentioned it and said that he compared it with the moon, which is what caused Steiner to say, I can't leave that out there. And he thought it was a very dangerous thing because the eighth sphere isn't completed yet, so it doesn't have the solid mass, and it's something that's under construction by Ahrimanic forces. And it's the way he describes it is it's a virtual reality realm, and it is a sphere that it can absorb human soul emanation. So when you get stuck inside this kind of virtual reality stuff, the eighth sphere is there, and it's part of this Ahrimanic thing. And the idea is that those forces will be subject, that part of humanity will be subject to Ahriman and not even be aware of the natural evolutionary spiritual track that would take place. So the eighth sphere information and Steiner coming out with it is an accident of history because Sinnott put it on the record incorrectly, and Steiner felt, I have to correct the record, and since it's already out there, he said, ordinarily, I would be under immense psychic attack, which I find interesting. But when we look at the situation, actually, what he was doing was correcting the record that Sinnott, in his book Esoteric Buddhism, mentions the eighth sphere. And the eighth sphere, that aspect of like surrounding the globe with a space fence, sometimes makes me think of that eighth sphere. Because again, there's something about the Ahrimanic forces that are all about imprisoning humanity's higher aspirations. So it's definitely anthroposophy where you're going to find the information around New Jupiter and the eighth sphere. That's really where it's rooted. And it's very innovative. Actually, in terms of other schools, they're all innovative in their own way. But the Steiner work, when you get into things like New Jupiter, I don't think there's a better description. Just like I don't think there's a better description of Atlantis than you find in the Casey work. I don't think there's a better description around where humanity is evolving towards than Steiner, which I think has incredible depth. Yes, Rita.
I'm going to pivot for a second. Elijah Poole Bay says, sheesh, I'm late. Did DJ talk about Lil Satan X yet? Are you going to address that?
Lil Nas X,
Lil Nas
the
X.
Satan shoes. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible, right? This is the kind of strange society we've woken up in. And, he's selling these shoes, and they have a drop of human blood in them. And they're called Satan shoes, and they have an upside down pentagram. I mean, all that stuff and all the stuff about being outrageous, and you can choose any spirituality you want. I mean, we've had Satanist cults before and all the rest, but it's just that in your face promotion of the stuff that is so obviously satanic that I think gives an average person the creeps, and they start to see, wait a minute, what's going on here? And Nike was connected with that. Well, Nike is now after those guys because Nike was getting so much blowback. And this is the thing. Again, they test the waters with these situations very often to see how far can they get it. Remember the cuties thing? They were like, is there a pulse among human parents? Do they worry about this stuff? So they
so do you think it's like a trial balloon? Like they're trying to test?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah. They do trial balloons, I think, pretty often. I think the vaccine passport has aspects.
So
of
it's
the trial
how
balloon.
degraded are they? Will this cause a ripple?
Is there any resistance?
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
No
That's
question.
interesting.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 100, Part 2. We're deep in the mystery schools now. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. We've been seeing everyone thrown off this platform. I actually had conversations with other YouTubers thrown off, and it is just ridiculous. But thank God we're still here.
Mhm.
So, I did mention the incredible censorship that Catherine Austin Fitts was under, and we did run some interviews of hers on Vimeo directly in the newsletter. So if you're on the newsletter list, which is a free newsletter, you can go ahead and listen to those interviews with her. We do have a part 3 episode with Fitz that is for subscribers as well. I highly recommend. This is a great time to subscribe because we have incredible things coming up for you as subscribers as well.
How long is that part 3 episode? Because I haven't even heard it yet.
Oh, it's great. It's an hour and 15 minutes.
There you go.
And there's a really in-depth profile of Andrew Cuomo and Fitz and her dealings with Cuomo, because she's really wondering, what is the New World Order doing flushing Cuomo? Because he's their main man. He has been for many years. So what's happening there really? And one of the strange conclusions that she comes to is that it's actually Trump who is pulling the strings on Cuomo there, and with reason, apparently. But it is quite fascinating indeed. So, but yeah, highly recommend that, and just make sure you're in that newsletter loop, because you'll get it once a week, and that just keeps us involved with each other without the interference of any. The social network didn't, how many times have I heard, I never got an announcement about this program? Well, if you're on the newsletter list, you'll get it. YouTube, it's hard to say, but we've had a really fun time with YouTube, so we'll do it as much as we can. Yes.
Okay, Najat Madri, could they be trying to convert Earth into the eighth sphere? And then I have a few follow-up questions on that.
Yes. The eighth sphere shouldn't be, it is something that we can picture as around the Earth, connected to the Earth. But it's something that is built by people's consciousness. And so the more that they see a false reality, the stronger the eighth sphere gets. The more that they forget their spirituality, the stronger the eighth sphere is. In the eighth sphere, individuals kind of disappear into that eighth sphere, and they're under, Ahrimanic law. And the Ahrimanic side of things just keeps humanity in a fantasy. And it drains off their deeper aspirations. So it's very important when dealing with Ahrimanic work to be very alert. So when people, are being trained from an early age, like a 3-year-old with virtual reality, or giving a 3-year-old an iPad, runs the risk. You want someone to have the developmental tools to, acquire incredible skills at an early age. But I think particularly with children, it allows them to be delivered into that digital realm, and they need all the protections first, so that goes not only against bizarre people online, but against the medium itself. So there's a kind of a spiritual thing that takes place there. The eighth sphere can be thought of as going into that virtual reality, and then you're thinking, and we've seen this with people before, they think that they're living, like that's life and this is it, but they're actually living in a totally false paradigm. And so I guess reality is malleable to a certain degree, and people have so many different perspectives. But what I'm talking about is a kind of manipulated reality, which we get very often through things like the media, entrainment technology, and things of this nature, where they're actually compounding a false reality. And so the eighth sphere work that comes out of Steiner's revelations about it is that, again, it's Ahrimanic, so it comes through the technology. Yes.
Can my well-intentioned soul get lost after death and trapped by Ahriman?
Yeah, when you think about this, there are all kinds of examples in spiritual literature or like Christian literature where the devil tempts Christ, So that's an aspect that exists in humanity, temptation and the 7 deadly sins. So there's no question that you have to be alert and active and working in the development of your own spiritual evolution to avoid those types of things. Just like in everyday life, you have to avoid certain types of dangers and things. So it becomes kind of like a muscle memory about how to do that. But yeah, you can go much deeper.
Does Steiner have any advice about what to do? The Gnostics say don't go to the light, right? You get trapped in the cycle of reincarnation, the archons, it's all a trick. What does he say?
Yeah, I don't
how
believe,
not to slip into the...
I certainly don't believe that. No, I think he talks about not letting Ahriman come upon humanity unawares. So just the mere fact that we're talking about it and aware of these types of things is a kind of awareness, and we all know, just like when we talk about people getting carried away or getting, too into something, or they have an addictive personality or whatever, it's a series of things. It's an accumulation of things. But no, if you have a well-intentioned soul, then you can call on your spiritual awareness. And, it's individual for everybody, but I would think that what we're talking about is a kind of an intuitive radar in essence. And that certainly wouldn't let you down.
Okay. Brandini Mancini. Does modern Buddhism acknowledge the eighth sphere? It seems not be a priority, perhaps Chinese censorship. Where else does the eighth sphere show up in literature and occult literature?
Well, we've heard things about purgatory. We've heard things about fantasy realms. So certainly the eighth sphere idea can be thought of as a fantasy virtual reality realm, where it seems like, you're moving into an evolutionary track because you're feeling good. And but the idea is, it traps you further and further down. If somebody walks around and they're just watching like violent action movies, and they drink a lot of alcohol, and they have a kind of a hedonistic nature, than that, they're getting more and more sucked into an eighth sphere style reality. When you see people who are hooked on video games, their consciousness is starting to go out. They're starting to get into the video game, and by not having a proper distance and awareness going into that experience, it's almost like they're asleep. And that's where MK Ultra came from, which became EMK Ultra, which they don't talk about very much. But video games, I think, are an excellent example, and especially video game apps on a phone. I've seen people just, So awareness is interesting. The mystery schools did, through Bennett and people like that, gave us these examples, which was to stretch your arms over your head. And then within about 10 seconds, that stretch goes lower because your thinking takes away from your physical awareness. So it's not that you should be on guard all the time, but it is that to have that central alert system inside, and that keeps that awareness going. And then, people know when they think greedy things or deceptive things and all these things come up, it's just like, do you become those thoughts, or do those thoughts go by? We always have those shows where they show like the devil on one side and the angel on the other. We have all the different aspects inside of us. So it all, there's a kind of awareness that goes into this. The idea that you can have a duller and duller consciousness, Gigi Young did a fabulous show on the Super Bowl entertainment thing, and the rituals that they were doing with that. That dulls your consciousness. You're just watching that. And if you are unawares, you just sink down with it. So, and that's just one example. There's so many examples of things that we feed ourselves. So we have to be very mindful not to feed ourselves fear porn or hope porn. We saw where the hope porn took us recently with, the Gaia TV type people trying to take us over a cliff. So I think it's very important to just maintain a kind of general spiritual alertness, and then it becomes part of your daily thing. What's strange is, when you work with the Gurdjieff work or Steiner stuff, and you spend a little time with it and then go out into the world seems very different. You realize, in a sense, that there's a degradation level of consciousness that's taking place because of the enormity of the technology addiction. And again, it's not to blast tech itself. I was a tech editor for a decade, and really get into the technological aspects. And I love what the technology can do, but I don't want to become just a tool of the technology. I'd like to use the technology as a tool. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Well, I think there's two thoughts ultimately, is that everything is sacred or everything is damned. It's dead. and has no soul, including us, right? And you can, if you're really mindful, you can pay attention to what you're doing, all of your actions, what you're paying attention to, your choices. You would eat differently if you thought about your body being sacred and the food being sacred and eating itself being sacred. Every moment of the day is sacred. That is, and it builds on itself.
That's
and
true.
The same thing is true on the opposite side. So if you're having a hellish day and you want to have junk food, and if you're not thinking, it is, you just miserable with your life and you feel damned and you're just going down that path of everything stinks, nothing matters, I don't matter. If you go down there far enough, it is hell, really. So that's where it is ultimately. And they have us on this path where we are not sacred. We have no souls. Nothing matters. It's nihilism. So you might as well live it. So there's no life after death. You might as well live it up now, right? Nothing matters. It's all about pleasure of the moment, right? And
well, they benefit the most when you think like that. This is the interesting thing. Absolutely. And it's amazing too, is that this is all part of that scientific materialism that we started the program off with. Because if you look at what Steiner says in the 1840s, they discovered, the mystery schools were looking at this and saying, humanity, we're not going to recognize them in 100 years if we don't let this information out, because they're going to be consumed by the most mundane thoughts. And they're going to split off their spirituality and not realize this incredible treasure trove of abilities that they have, because the scientific materialism expert is going to say, nope, we can't weigh or measure that. It doesn't exist. And what's interesting, and this doesn't come into the equation too much, but this is one of the first times that the kind of esoteric schools and the religious institutions worked a little bit in tandem because they also resisted the scientific materialism as well, because after all, their bread and butter is the spiritual reality, even if a lot of the churches are operating on a very superficial spiritual level as well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 100, Part 2, deep into the mystery schools, Sorobia, Stell, and Steiner. We're going to be taking a couple more questions, and I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. Make sure that you're on that free newsletter list so we can get that information to you, and we can kind of co-create with the folks in the ideas room in a deeper way. There are some major changes coming to the website, so this is the time now to join, and you'll be hearing a lot about those, along with some incredible guests and events that we have coming up for you, as well as X Series 100 Part 3. Okay, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Kat Goida, who is leading the mystery schools now?
Yeah, that's interesting. There's no one person, I think, who leads the mystery schools, but I think that the mystery traditions are upheld by advanced beings. And I think that the traditions have been passed down to people in schools who have been maintaining this kind of sacred tradition. That's where we see the extegonography come up through these different traditions, all the way back to the Book of the Dead, through the Pythagoras schools, through the Middle Ages, and Trithemius and his work with steganography, and then onward through people like Theosophy and Steiner, etc. They're linking us back and telling us there's a group there that's guiding humanity along, and that they come into, they seem to make their presence known at different times. And they do have those who are associated with them replete throughout society, in business circles, in education circles, in political circles. So representatives of those mystery schools are deep in that system. There's a lot of different levels, as I've described, with mystery schools. So what we can talk about for sure is the public mystery schools and their associations. For example, anthroposophy comes directly out of a Rosicrucian model. It comes out of the Rosicrucian pattern. I would say Theosophy embraces at its core, it embraces all the deeply held spiritual religious belief systems. And what comes out of that before Theosophy has difficulties and gets too Eastern is Steiner's work comes out of that. At a certain point, he says, because there was a distortion there and because the left-hand schools were like, all hands on deck, let's stop Blavatsky, that the Western initiators decided to withdraw from Blavatsky and said, we're going to try another way. I believe the other way was the Edgar Cayce work, which actually has a much deeper influence than maybe we realize. And it's also distorted, right? People are always saying, I'm Edgar Cayce, or they're distorting the story, his background story with Rata and things like that. Or they're trivializing him as just a doomsday prophet or whatever. So I think that those schools work through individuals. Remember, one of the things that Steiner identified was that they were working through the Poughkeepsie seer, who was one individual. So it's one individual at a time, just like working with Blavatsky. So it is that incredible influence that we feel from these different mystery schools. And I think they're more active now than ever, but we've been going through a period where they have withdrawn to watch the action on the surface. And what we got out of it was a lot of the after effects of, there were a lot of strange things that came out of Theosophy, including, as we said, the whole Space Brothers thing. So yeah, what happens with that? It's interesting if you look at it. If you look at the Muslim aspects and you look at it in the 30s and 40s, it's totally different than the kind of radicalized version that came up later. So, it's always interesting. I think those schools are always watching and looking for ways to move the culture forward. Yes.
Cylindro Andromeda. Please ask DJ his view on the 20th century Bodhisattva announced by Blavatsky and Steiner alike.
It is. I mean, there is something there with the whole idea of the world teacher. And I think it became a punchline because of what Ledbetter and Besant did in trying to force it through Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti, by the way, suffered incredible physical issues when he gave up the role, because whatever it was that they were trying to channel through him was still, was a whole process that was set up with the coming of the world teacher. And so by being created for this role and then by rejecting it, he had to go through a long sort of walk in the desert there. But I think it is interesting because the idea is that the world teacher would incarnate and that humanity has that ability to accept, this role. What Steiner was saying was a little bit different. He said, we've kind of gone past the point, of the ascended masters standing in for us. We need to stand up now for ourselves. It's almost like we've passed the teenager stage and we're here and, we've been drafted and we're taking on the real thing. So certainly a world teacher can help dramatically, but it is the effort through our own individual will and working collectively towards a kind of that real spiritual outcome. And I think we have the ability to do it. So many of the ideas from questions inspire me to say that as a group, we have the ability to do these things. Yes.
And developing a discipline, a practice of some kind. If there's one thing that the elites have done, it's put us into a dire situation where it's all hands on deck. So either people are, people either wake up because of their fear or they go deeply deep to sleep, and so a lot of us are very awake and looking to ourselves and asking ourselves what we can do that we have not been doing, that we've been procrastinating on.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And I think we have to, it's inevitable. We've seen with just a few examples tonight how the guru trip can get very, very messy. And I remember Krishnamurti, he met one of the top gurus in the 1980s, and he was talking to him. And he said the whole conversation that guru was saying, and then I have 200 followers, like I have these followers in Australia. And he starts going on. This guy would have loved Facebook and Twitter, but all he could do when he was sitting there with Krishnamurti with all his spiritual knowledge, and this guy was like a top guru, just wanted to go over the many like fans and devotees that he had. So you can see, you can do all this stuff and set yourself up to advance and just step in it. I've often said this too, and I want to point this out. The Kinninger story is a good warning on this too. Like, there's a line that comes directly out of the Bible, which is, it would be better for someone not to have pursued this path in the first place than to pursue it and then turn back. So that's kind of an eye-opening suggestion, which is, the whole point is, if somebody wants to be like a scumbag or really come from a lower space, then you should stick to Wall Street, maybe be the bookkeeper at a strip club or whatever it happens to be. That world is waiting there for you. And I'm sure there's many upstanding bookkeepers for strip clubs. I'm just saying, it would make more sense to work on Wall Street or the mafia or the corrupt political establishment. There's all kinds of opportunities for doing those types of things. But don't go out there and say you're a spiritual person and then start acting like, a drag of society. I think this is an even worse thing. It's funny, being here on Good Friday and with Easter, I have more Jesus quotes for you. This one's a good one where he is going back and forth with the Pharisees, and at a certain point, they're like, you speak out of turn, and you're like John the Baptist. And he says, well, John the Baptist came to you in righteousness and you chopped his head off. So he said, your problem is you are speaking in a way that you know the truth, but you're not going in yourself, and you're not letting these people go in, because you're basically just hung up on lording that over people so that they, the worst in society at that time, and he would say, like harlots and tax collectors, right? They're going to get into heaven before you will. And like the Pharisees would flip out at him. So this is very interesting, I feel, principle-wise, because what he's saying is, in your role, if you have accepted this role of leading humanity, actually, you raise the stakes on yourself about what you can do. And if you're just going to act like a drag of society, as I mentioned, then you might as well just be in some lower profession, as it were. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are going to take a few more questions. It's great with the Ideas Room tonight. Keep it going. A lot of great people out there. We hope everyone is going to have a happy, fascinating Easter weekend. And, I think there's so many things about the esoteric understandings about Christ as well that we need to look at when we talk about all of these mystery schools, because the ultimate initiate, of course, is Christ Jesus. So when we think about that, I can say Casey identified the past lives of Jesus, including as Adam. And then someone who doesn't believe in reincarnation or whatever would just say, well, thanks, DJ, but I don't believe in reincarnation, so that doesn't mean anything to me. But for me, it's absolutely fascinating, because out of those mystery school traditions about Christ, we learn more. And then I remember there's a reading with Edgar Casey where they say, when did Christ become aware that he was going to become the Savior? And Casey's answer was, when he fell in Eden. Think about that. If this is the same soul that fell in Eden and then comes back and lifts that whole pattern, then he's got the whole pattern for us, because we go through that same cycle and come out the other side. And finally, we win over the physical realm and we win over death. Just like when the Great White Brotherhood had their ritual of in the pyramid, you would be in that sarcophagus for 3 days, and then you'd come out of it. The Essene Brotherhood had that exact tradition. And so Christ, when he's doing it, he enacts it in the flesh. He actually does it. The training is, as if dead. You die in the tomb and you come back 3 days later. So to actually do it and create the pattern and make it actual, this is so very interesting and I think very fascinating. There's a deep, deep metaphysical level beyond the regular Christianity, the way it's portrayed. There's no question about it. But, the regular Christianity has all the deep principles there. But it's the esoteric Christianity that's always grabbed my attention. And the work like Steiner, like Gurdjieff, and, Casey's work, that's all esoteric Christianity. Yes.
Havartian. I've read so little about the mystery schools. Which book should I pick up first?
I actually like the book I cited earlier, which was the Steiner book. The actual name of it is Spiritualism, Madame Blavatsky, and Theosophy, an eyewitness view of occult history. There's such an overview in here that I would highly recommend it. I also think The Transcendental Universe is another really important book. Dion Fortune did really interesting books relating to the mystery school traditions and the Gurdjieff work, In Search of the Miraculous. I mean, Ouspensky is walking around with a mystery school initiate who is Gurdjieff, but I wanted to mention this about something that seemed to go on as part of this letting this information out, is they let individuals out also. So this whole idea about when you go into a group, you, just like in Masonry and in the Masonic schools, you make pledges. So in the mystery schools, you are pledged at a certain degree level. You have to make a pledge about your conduct and what you will do. So when we think about esoteric schools, this is the level that they're operating on. So the people involved form a bond based on their mutual pledge to a certain type of activity. And when we think about Gurdjieff coming out and giving his version, being a kind of a maverick that he was, and he was sent out to develop a new way to integrate the mystery school information into the public. But he was no longer bound as he was inside the mystery schools. So he sort of lost access to those mystery schools. They brought him up to a certain level and let him out into the world as part of their experiment, in a sense, to see what he could do. And, with Gurdjieff, his activity, he's always training and learning, but according to Ouspensky, his activity doesn't always measure up to someone you would think was a mystery school, somebody who was pledged on that level. Not to say that he did anything that was particularly immoral, but the way that he behaved, would lend itself to somebody saying that. So what happens is these guys get outside of the circle of the mystery school and they're sent out there to do it on their own. So I think that we can see that pattern play out in a few different cases. I think in Steiner's case, he, at a certain point, he's sort of born into this, but at a certain point, he's introduced to a master of the Rosicrucian tradition. And so I think that what he did, and he talks about this, that he realized there's a certain point where you can't hold this stuff in just a secret fashion anymore, and that he can't make pledges to hold these things secret. So, there's an aspect of this. When Ouspensky meets Gurdjieff, it's the same thing. He says, I want the ability to work with you, but I want to be able to record it, and I want to put it out eventually publicly so that people knew exactly what this movement was all about. And Gurdjieff says, okay, but you have to tell it exactly as it happened. So, we're getting it around there, which is that the mystery school openness is something that they are now doing, and it's happening more and more. It becomes part of that. And I think that we see their independent operators, they look out and they say to somebody like Gurdjieff, a lot of people were like, well, if this guy was connected with the mystery schools, why didn't he just, every time there was a problem, go back to the mystery school and try to figure it out? It wasn't like that anymore. He was out there, he was doing his own thing. He had absorbed the teaching. So I think that they placed a lot of people like that. Just as people like Bennett and Ouspensky were placed out there by Gurdjieff to do their own thing. This is kind of the key aspect, which is now the mystery schools got us up to a point where they wanted these small concentrated communities to survive a real collapse in the societal structure. And I think we're seeing that collapse of the societal structure. So how much have we absorbed the information that's been placed out there? It's a good question.
MTRYP, when the mystery schools surface again to move the culture forward, what do you think that will look like in this current landscape?
Well, they already have. So again, I think it's about us picking up the things that they've left there. I don't think that they ever stop being active. I just think that they're very intense at times, like 1875, and lay back at other times. I remember in the Steiner work where he says, the mystery schools have failed, World War I is upon us. Therefore, all the lectures that I had that were reserved just for students, I'm letting them out to the public. And the idea was we can't hold this stuff back, because what's happening is these forces, the souls of humanity will get so caught up in the battle between these forces that we need to have that spiritual information out there. So they take a risk when they do that, because remember, a lot of Nazism, for example, was based on a complete misuse of the theosophical tradition. They take a chance when they put this information out there because of the things we might do with it. Here's the principle. Esoteric information operates in a certain circle. When you take the esoteric information and you put it into the public, it becomes part of the exoteric circle, which means it starts to act what? Mechanically. So we can hear a phrase like, your mind can keep you well, right? And it's a great phrase, and it's true. And we can understand it deeply. Or we can just hear it as a phrase like, oh, your mind can keep you well, and that's kind of a superficial understanding of it. So there is a certain point where these things that are kept in that esoteric circle have a power that when it gets loosed out, it starts to act mechanically in the everyday run of things. That's why sometimes you would run into people who you felt were the most unspiritual people on planet Earth, and they would say, I'm so glad I've just achieved this thing with my chakras and I'm much more enlightened. And I'd be sitting there thinking to myself, when I've run across these people at the time, and I'm not judgmental at all, but it would be funny to me because I would be thinking to myself, oh, I know how this person is, and I don't think that they've really advanced much spiritually at all. So, that's that deeper language about chakras and Kundalini and all this stuff. But if it's used in a superficial fashion, it doesn't mean anything. What does it actually mean to just say, I've raised my Kundalini, my third eye is open? Anyone can say it. But what does it actually mean to do it? And then if you knew what it actually mean to do it, then the way that you speak about it's a little bit differently.
Well, you probably wouldn't speak about it.
Or if you did, it would have some power to it. So,
what does Casey say? It's to be good for something, right? Not just good, but to be good for
something. I love
something.
that
It's
quote.
service.
That's one of the best ever. It's, don't just try to be good for something, which means what can you do? Don't just think, well, I'm a great person because I wish you the best. That's good too. But what can you actually do? How do you serve? And That's the whole point. This is an interesting, fascinating, deep esoteric principle, which is about service, which is why companies like Amazon stress things like service, not because they care about humanity, but because they understand the esoteric underpinning of that phrase. And that goes deep into the Christian tradition, because he says who would be the master of you would be the servant of all. That's his role. And what does he do at the Last Supper? He washes the feet of his disciples. Is that a Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos thing of like sitting up at the World Economic Forum and saying, we are the new elite and we're going to tell you what to do? They're not trying to serve anybody. So this is the nature of our human consciousness. And I guess we all come to these things differently. Last question, Miss Olivia.
Okay, Gillenjoy R. Why don't these mystery schools help us beat these powers that should not be?
Yeah, well, they do. They certainly do. How much of their information have we absorbed and try to work with? There's a lot of information that Steiner has left for us. Have we gotten through it? Have we absorbed all the stuff? Well, it's always ongoing. These are things that are happening now. So it's not like I'm supposed to go back to 1898 and learn what Steiner, said, and that's supposed to be it. It's supposed to kind of integrate the information that's been left on this level. So I always think of Autobiography of a Yogi, because there's great information in there, and it's a really good integration of I'm spiritually advanced, but I'm living in the real world, and this is, I think, what we really need to do as things are set up now in society. That whole idea, like in the Fourth Way, that the only way that we can advance is by taking on the challenges. This is what Steiner said in relation to Ahriman. The idea wasn't, let's get rid of technology. We'll be able to advance that way, and Ahriman can't possess us. On the eighth sphere, it can't happen. No, we have to take that knowledge from Ahriman for the higher creative forces. So we are the arms and legs of the universe doing that. But it is one hell of a battle. I don't think there's any question about that. And so, it's not for the faint of heart, for sure. But no, there's so many things, I think, to learn on a regular basis, and even operating as a group. The exchanges that we have here in the ideas room, there's a quality to the energy that is exchanged. So if we keep that quality in mind, then those questions move around, like consciousness starts to move around, intuition starts to open up. So there's so much of that here. And how much, even in a group that we have here right now, how much are we able to open up that energetic, circuit? And I think that it happens, and you can feel it. Have you ever watched one of Gigi Young's programs, or when Gigi's on the show, and you just feel, my consciousness is higher somehow?
I can tell you, when Gigi's in the chat and she's in the ideas room, I can feel my consciousness rise. I'm serious.
It's great. And I feel that as well. I feel it about so much of you as well. So this is more, as I say, it's like a real exchange that we do here with the information. So it's great for us to share it with you. And wow, it's fantastic for us to have you to share it with. Everyone, it's been great having you here tonight. I'm going to do a couple of quick shout outs, but first, Miss Olivia's shout outs.
Okay. All right. I have a bunch of people to thank. Gillenjoy R, Gaia Sophia, Eurythmy is Fun, Love, Eternal, John R, A. Sohn, and Gummy Bears, Maggie Smith, Vern Baumgartner, Roger Saw, Nicholas Tsangaris, Roosevelt Media News, Adam Owen, Channeling the Heart, Barbara Joyce, Sheila Fisher, Doreen Hewitt, H. Hale, Bill Gometz, Josh Randall, Carol Crumlish, and Bill Clayman. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, incredible. That's really incredible. That kind of support helps us so much, and it makes a huge difference to all those who are supporting us. We really appreciate it. And of course, to our great subscribers. We couldn't do it without you. So I really appreciate it. We will be back, coming back with some great interviews for you. And then later in April, we'll be coming back with the Live X series part 3, 100 part 3. And I'll tell you, it's a real mind blower. And there are a lot of aspects from part 1 and part 2 blended together. And so we're really looking forward to doing those shows for you. I invite you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, become a subscriber, and get behind the work that we're doing here. And we really appreciate you being with us. Catherine Harris, Katie Cat, Frank Monday, a cult fan, Beth Barry, Frank Castle, Adam Huglow. Thank you. I appreciate that. Brandy Renee, Living Soul Quickening Spirit. That's a good name. Gigi Young. Thank you, Gigi. Appreciate it. I can't wait for your next show. Najat, great to see you. And we're going to have Gigi back soon, too. Probably the end of the month. Slick
Bring
Dissident.
back that chain smoking dude. Gee, I wonder who that is.
Oh, hey, listen, some very interesting things with Dr. Farrell coming up. Josh Randall, fantastic to see you, sir. Who else we got out here? John Guilfoyle. Dana Stinnett Jackson. Kathy Thompson. Hey, great crowd tonight. Excellent. Allison Murphy. Scarlet Fire. Roosevelt, of course, the one, the only. Gaia Sophia. Wow. Fantastic.
You know,
crew that
I just want to
intro.
throw in, there's one really edgy question because it could mean a
Of
couple
course.
things. Okay, John Luther says, can't we use both hands? Which can mean a couple different things. But it is a
For
deep
the
question.
left hand and the right hand?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, my strange take on that is that when Steiner talks about the left-hand schools, he says he's talking about them, and then he talks about a group that is using these techniques, and he's like, they are the worst kind of left-hand group. It's like, they have no level, and like basically might is right is their whole motto. But what's interesting is he talks about them as like basically a super left school, meaning that there's room now between what a left school is and what a very left school is. And I guess that means for the right-hand path, there's the right-hand path, and then there's a very right-hand path. Very interesting, I think, when you put those things together. Who knew there was a super dark left-hand school? That's something else, isn't it? So I think it kind of gives us an idea that there's some room for maneuver.
Can I throw out one more question?
Beth Barry, yes.
Ed Kaufman. So were there other Wall Street lawyers aware of the work of the mystery schools like Alan Dulles, Wild Bill Donovan, lawyers connected with intelligence services?
Oh, they know a lot about. They
Yeah.
studied. Hey, look, they had a program in the CIA, which Dulles, remember, was running the CIA from 53 to 61. In 64, when he was doing the Warren Commission, the CIA had a program to infiltrate the Casey Foundation for information on the Hall of Records underneath the Sphinx. Can you imagine? This was their program. That's declassified. We know that program happened. It's not a conspiracy
What was the
theory.
result of that?
They just passed information about what they found out about it. But the fact that they were interested in it, of course they follow these things. They have such a deep handle on it. And, I think they come from a place of trying to use those things, of course. So, I don't think that they're coming from a good place with it, but the information is something that's very valuable to them.
Well, is this what they're doing in CERN?
Oh, no question.
Mm-hmm.
CERN is a very manipulated project with a false front. There's no doubt about it. But hey, they have a $20 billion budget now. I know Joseph Farrell would like that one. That's a military-style budget. What on earth are you going to do with that except make a CERN that's called ALICE? Well, they already did that. And what does ALICE do? It has the hottest and the coldest temperature ever on Earth. It generates both. It's kind of interesting. Wow, just fascinating stuff, everyone. Miss Olivia, fantastic tonight. Great insights. Nicely done.
Thank you.
We will see you all next week, everyone. And it's been outstanding. Have a great Easter. And we are going to be keeping our eye on the evil passport and all of the dangerous things that are included with that. So we're going to be coming back at you with a report on that. And we have some great interviews coming up for you. We will see you next week. Miss Olivia, you get
I'm
the last
starving.
word. A brownie sundae. Let me guess.
We got some blueberry pie.
Blueberry pie. Wow.
Mm.
Jeez, that's pretty good. We'll see you all next week with an interview, and then we'll be back with the live show later in April. So have a great night, everyone. And remember that mystery school tradition goes deep, and we'll be covering that as we go. So remember, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends, does it?
Happy Easter.
Kat Goida, it's great to see you. Wow, great crowd tonight. Outstanding. Jay Doe. Auntie Queenie, I can't help. I'm in a big shout out mode here. Carl Young. Kushara. It's great to see you out there. Scarlet Fire. Hey. Grandma Tippy Toes. Beth Barry. Carolyn Rose. Jennifer and Bucks. Wow. Great ideas from tonight. See you soon.
Okay. God bless.